This is Trial Transcripts Exposed by Crime in Court with Heather. Raw courtroom reads with my commentary. Let's dive in. Hi everyone, welcome back to Crime in Court with Heather. This is Trial Transcripts Exposed. We are on part 78 of the defense's case, which means we are getting closer to the end. We have 92 parts of of the defense's case. Then we're going to get to rebuttals, and then obviously they go into the penalty phase, which is going to come up after their guilt phase, which we'll go over as well. All right, so just an FYI, hold on. Nope. Hold on. Sorry. We have construction going on in the house. We're getting new countertops today, which is nice. And then the dogs are up here with me upstairs, and they're locked in. They don't like that, so they're kind of anxious. So you might hear noises in the background. So apologies for that. Before we get into our reading, let me thank my founding justice insiders, and those would be Toyota Girl 67. SLB 29488. May the force be with you 4313. Jessica Weenan 6079. Mrs. Apples 2007. Butler 89833. Brooke JF. Jen P 773. Boom Chickawawa 1. Kendall B 5757. Carly 0406. Oh, Ashley 83. True Crime Debates. Sandy South 5706. Chickenhead 33. That one just makes me laugh. I'm sorry, it does. Do you guys, speaking of Chickenhead, I don't know, it just reminded me of Buckethead. So some of you, if you know me in real life, you know that I am a gigantic Guns N' Roses fan. And during a period of time when they were broken up, there was a guitarist. He kind of replaced Slash in Guns N' Roses. I mean, there's no replacement for Slash. So, I mean, just let's get that straight. Nobody sounds like Slash. Slash is an amazing guitarist. But anyways, so was Buckethead. There was a guy who wore like a white mask on his face, and then he wore like this bucket over his head. Or am I confusing that wrong? Anyways, he had a bucket. It was a KFC bucket, like upside down on his head. You didn't see his face, regardless of whether he had like something on his face or not. It was the bucket pretty much covered him. He played like that on stage. You never saw his face. So let me actually, you know what? While we're talking about it, I don't want you guys to think that I'm crazy. So I'm going to show you a picture of it. Bear with me. Okay. So I wasn't crazy. I'm going to show you this. So these are pictures of Buckethead. So I can't, they're not getting bigger for me. Hold on. Okay, we have very slow internet today for some reason. But this is Buckethead. I was correct. He wore something white over his face, and then he had a bucket over his head. That one doesn't look like a KFC one, but usually it was a KFC. There it says KFC General. I think he wrote on there. That's a really tiny picture of him, but you get the idea. So I'm not crazy. He is actually, no, that says funeral on it. There's like some tape on there that says funeral across it, but it is a KFC bucket upside, as you can see. Anyways, so that particular screen name always reminds me of that Buckethead, chicken head. It's funny to me. So whoever you are, your handle makes me laugh. Next, this one frustrates me because I don't know how to say it. Nicotini, I think, or something like that. Or it's a zero. Nicoti zero Neurotini, one or the two. I am not sure. Then we have that So Nelly. Then we have Julie E 6770, 1-800 Fraudbusters, Bezo Jones, and Hannah Banana Bandana 23. Thank you all for being founding Justice Insiders. They were there from the very beginning. And then we also have additional Justice Insiders, Lainey Jane 91, Couch Potato Pro, and Tech Vibe _42. Thank you for being members. All right. So let us get back to our transcript. We are starting the day off Monday, January 22nd, 1996. And Judge Weisberg says, everyone's here. We're outside the presence of the jury. Is there something you wanted to discuss? Ms. Abramson says, I wanted to discuss the people's request concerning the matters upon which Dr. Wilson relied, and I'm trying to work out a reasonable way to give the people what they're entitled to without causing total ransacking and destruction of Dr. Wilson's files. What I have done is listed by witness, name, document, name and dates of interviews to the extent that there are witness interviews that he relied on, everything that he tells me that he relied on, and it boils down to categories. The first category being witnesses whose testimony from the first trial he's relying on. The second is witness statements that have all been previously provided to the prosecution, and we have the transmittal documents to prove it, with the names of the witness and the dates of the interviews. And then there are a group of additional witness statements to which the people were not entitled on discovery, either because they occurred before the discovery cutoff date, that 991 date, or because they were statements of witnesses that we never intended to call at trial. I should note that we did give the police statements of many, many witnesses who we did not, in fact, call at the trial last time because we were considering doing so at various times. This smaller group of witness statements are people that we did not intend to call, and I have today for the people's some copies of all of those statements that the group of witnesses we do not intend to call, or those previous statements were exempted from the time cutoff. Then, so she's got a bunch of things to hand over to the state regarding witness statements, apparently, but some got cut off because of time constraints or something. They missed a deadline. The next category is limited testimony from the current trial. There's a brief category from of some oral information that Dr. Wilson received from Dr. Stuart Hart and from the witness Diane Vandermullen, and then there's a list of documents, all of which the prosecution has. So what I propose to do, Your Honor, is if the court believes that's satisfactory compliance, I'm prepared to turn over to the people the statements they have not previously been entitled to, along with this list. And my suggestion would be that if there's any specific statement or a document that they want to see for whatever reason, even though they already have it from Dr. Wilson's file, we can try to pull it from the files. He arranged his files by witness and by category, and we didn't want to wholesale take them apart just to be able to show the people what he relied on. All right, I need a sip of water. It's already getting heated, and it's just the beginning of the day. And that's the package of documents and the list. And would the court like me to file a copy of the list with the court? The court says, not right now. I assume your direct examination is going to consume a little more time. Ms. Abramson says, yes, Your Honor. Court says, how much longer? Ms. Abramson says, probably the day. The court says, I don't see any reason to delay things further at this point on this issue, since it would only arise at the conclusion of the direct examination. Anything else before we have the jury out? Ms. Abramson says, well, before I read on, I'm going to let you know he's going to be on the witness stand for at least 4 more days, I believe, Dr. John Wilson. So we're going to continue to hear from him about hypervigilance and the psychological effects of severe repetitive trauma and growing up in that environment. And that includes his direct and cross examination. He'll be on the stand for 4 more days. For us, that'll be at least, I think, 8 episodes, but we'll get through it. All right. So Ms. Abramson says, well, at some point, I do want to be heard. I want to mark a chart that I used in opening statements for Dr. Wilson, but we're not there yet. Court says, all right. Did you want to mark that now? All right. Says Ms. Abramson, there are 3 boards that consist of 2 different charts that I used in the opening statements that I would like to mark. I take that back. The first board is excerpts from the 1211 tape transcript, and I don't believe there was any dispute at all about the words on those 2 pages. It's pages 26 and 28. This is my client speaking, talking about choice, etc. I think we're at 401. The court says, the clerk says 402. Ms. Amerson says, okay. And another chart is a synopsis of things my client testified to concerning the last week. And this is just for use as a guide by Dr. Wilson to describe in PTSD context, cues, and reactions. I'd like to mark that as 403. The court says, all right, 403. Ms. Abramson says, I'm going to put these back now because we're not there yet. The court says, are we ready for the jury? Are we ready for the jury? Ms. Amerson says, I'm sorry, Your Honor. Yes. The court says, people ready? Yes, says Mr. Khan. The court says, let's get the jury. So now the jury comes out and the court says, good morning. We're ready to resume with the trial. The witness is still on the witness stand. And so Dr. John P. Wilson resumes the stand. Court reminds him he's still under oath and we're ready for direct examination to continue with this witness. Also, another announcement, if you ever are looking to, skip ahead, maybe you don't want to listen to the arguments outside the presence of the jury or whatever, or maybe you just want to, skip around to certain parts, or maybe you left and then lost your spot and needed to come back. There are timestamps under all of my videos. So like the first couple minutes, it'll say, intro and thank yous for Justice Insiders. And then uh, for whatever time we get started with the transcript, I'll start there. It'll be the next timestamp. So in case you're ever looking to skip around or whatever, some people might not like the arguments. I think we get a lot of good information about what's going on behind the scenes when we listen to the arguments, though. So I like to keep them in. Anyways, okay, so direct continues of Dr. Wilson, and Ms. Abramson says, Dr. Wilson, when we broke last Friday, you had just completed charting on Exhibit 401 the results of administering that particular examination to my client, Erik Menendez, and you also charted the PTSD profile. How would you explain what the red profile means? We've used the words rather loosely, mean and average, in describing this line and in describing another line that appears on another chart. What does the red line signify on that chart? Dr. Wilson responds, the red line on the chart, which is indicated with a PTSD profile, refers to average scores or mean scores, and those terms are the same. The average score means for each of the subscales on the chart that the average score represents for persons who have been diagnosed as having PTSD. When they take the test, this is their average score on each of those separate scales. And the profile then represents their profile as charted, drawing the lines between each of the scales, representing the common post-traumatic stress disorder profile for persons who have had a positive diagnosis of PTSD. Now, common is different, though, than average. Doesn't average assume some are higher and some are lower? Yes. Is there a cutoff point, however, say below which on some of these scales or above which on other scales you couldn't support a diagnosis of PTSD? Yes, you can look at it that way, certainly. Now, average and mean, are those terms different than the word median? Yes. What does median mean? Average means when you average all of the scores of any given measure, you find the average of those scores, ranging from the lowest score to the highest score. Well, what's the average or what's the mean score? Median score refers to the midpoint of the range. So, starting at the very lowest score and going up to the very highest score on any measure, that's that's generically scored. The median is the midpoint score within the range, whereas the average represents the average score across all of the available scores within a given range. Okay, this is just confusing. I don't even know what he's saying, and he's just talking in big words. Am I the only one here that he's just talking big words? For the purpose of coming up with a guideline, if you will, from which to determine whether a particular patient based on their scoring on this examination confirms PTSD, it would not be appropriate to use the median, would it? No. It's like the difference between the median income of a group of people and the average income. That's correct. Now, have you finished telling us the significance of the particular scores that Erik Menendez had on this examination? No. All right. If you could continue then, what else was significant besides the fact that this profile emerged that indicated that he fit the PTSD profile? There are several things that are significant. Get, uh, what I What I didn't get to say last time is at the bottom, I charted starting with the highest subscale scores. If you can see the chart, the first one says IE for intrusive experiences. In the parentheses, I gave the numerical score, which reflects the evaluation on the chart. So, for example, if we look at IE in parentheses, the number 89, and go over to the chart and look at IE, we see that's the highest peak on this particular chart. Are you talking about this? Miss Abramson points to the chart. You're saying that you put IE here and said, and this is the IE column? That's correct. And that's the highest score. That's the mean of all he says that's the highest score. That's the mean of all the subscales that measure trauma symptoms with the particular questionnaire. Erik Menendez scores highest on the trauma symptoms for intrusive re experiencing. Okay, that's number one. So he keeps re experiencing these abusive, traumatic moments in his life that it's like interfering with his everyday. That's so sad. So if you will, that's kind of number one in the profile or number one in the equation. Then I've charted number two, which is AA, and in parentheses, the score is 79. Now, AA represents the trauma-related symptoms of anxious arousal. And if you would go back to the chart, you can see where that elevation is, and that is the first peak outside of the validity scale. It's the number one scale where it says AA at the bottom. Then we go to the next highest score, which is D, and in parentheses, it gives a numerical score of 78. And we look at the bottom. D is the second clinical scale, and that stands for depression. That's the third highest subscale measuring trauma symptoms of Erik Menendez. The next one we look at is DIS, which is the dissociative scale, and in parentheses, it indicates the score of T score 70. So that's the next highest entry. So the dissociative quality of post traumatic stress disorder symptoms now enters the fourth highest dimension of his response on the trauma symptom inventory. That's followed by ISR, impaired self-reference, at 67, and that's the last elevated dot that you can see at the very next to the end of the chart. It's the next to the last subscale at the bottom with the initials ISR. So that then identifies the highest points that are clinically elevated. In other words, they're above the mean score and they're above statistically the elevation score. So if you can look at the profile and see where it says 65, you see the black line that crosses the profile there, 65. I do, but let me see, says Ms. Abramson. The witness says, it's that black line running horizontally across the profile. That's it right there. This black line, says Ms. Abramson. Stay there for a minute, he says. What that represents statistically is the cutoff point at which all scores above that black line are revealed. Anything above that line statistically is elevated because that represents what's called a standard deviation from the mean. It means it's far out in terms of a normal curve of distribution of scores. So, one of the things we look at using psychometric testing with this instrument is how many of those points are above the line and how many of them are there. In other words, how high is the elevation on the scales? Then the second thing we do is say we've identified those that are above 65 at the extreme elevations. What's the ordering of those elevations? So they now give us a composite profile which tells us how these trauma symptom clusters are related to one another. What I did say fully last time was when we look at the ordering that I just identified for Erik Menendez, that he has extremely high levels of intrusive experience symptoms. In fact, he's at the highest point possible on the chart. Then he's followed by symptoms of intense anxiety, high anxiety arousal, and that's followed by symptoms of depression and feeling blue and wanting to take his own life. That's followed by dissociative symptoms. These are changes in consciousness, in awareness, changes in thought states, and finally, that's followed by impaired self reference, which means he's endorsing items indicating problems with self esteem, personal identity, and those kinds of things. Now, once that's charted, we can then go to the instruction manual and say, all right, does this profile match up to other known profiles for persons who have had histories of psychological trauma, for persons who have histories of childhood sexual abuse? And if so, is it a match? And the answer here is it matches. So, in everyone's faces who says they didn't get traumatized or have childhood sexual abuse because all of their reporting was extremely consistent with someone who experienced severe trauma in childhood SA. That's what we know, meaning that when you get this test to people who report or who have a known history of childhood SA, patients who are in hospitals who are being treated for psychiatric and psychological problems related to physical trauma, childhood sexual trauma, and other forms of psychological trauma, they tend to generate the same profile we see here from Erik Menendez. Now, the final piece here, and this is where we left off last time, is I put on the chart this red line, the standard PTSD profile identified by Dr. Briere, the creator of the test for comparison purposes. So again, the red line says, okay, for persons identified in the general population who have had post-traumatic stress disorder, when they take this questionnaire and they answer it, that's how they tend to answer. So that identifies a positive group of people who have a known diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what I did was to superimpose Erik Menendez's responses and compare them to the known population of people with PTSD. And I think where we left off Friday afternoon was I was pointing out that on many of the scales of the trauma symptom inventory, his scores are substantially higher than the PTSD profile. So he's got higher scores than most people who have gone through trauma and SA and similar experiences. He goes on to say, meaning that these symptoms, so his scores are substantially higher than the PTSD profile, meaning that his symptoms are more severe. He's beyond what we would know to be the kind of average post-traumatic stress profile, with the exception of a couple of areas. And those areas we identified last week as having to do with sexual concerns, dysfunctional sexual behavior, tension-reducing behaviors, and anger and irritability. Those subscales are the bottom points on the graph and they're not elevated. So, what we're really seeing in summary is that he is, when he took this test, is manifesting trauma symptoms consistent with the diagnosis of PTSD. So, his symptoms are very much consistent with what someone who has suffered PTSD would be having. His scores are above, for the most part, the PTSD profile in the population in the configuration, that is, how the scores are ordered from highest to lowest, meets the profile identified by Dr. Briere for a positive PTSD diagnosis. According to this test, he has it. And in the places where he is not elevated, where people with PTSD may be, do you have an opinion as to whether his situation, being in jail, for example, has any influence on why, for example, concern about sexual life or improper sexual activity that doesn't exist in his life? Is that something that you considered in trying to understand why he'd be so much lower than the ordinary on that? Yes. Let me clarify specifically on that question. So, one of the categories that is evaluated in this or these tests that he's going over is the I just totally lost my train of thought. Um oh, what would be evaluated, like all these different categories of his life, like how he responds to things and how different things, different categories in his life are, whether he has positive or negative, um like a negative scale on his life. I don't know how you would say it. I'm totally losing my train of thought. But anyways, so one of the categories that they would talk about or evaluate would be his current sexual life, his current sexual activities. But seeing as how he is now in prison and he does not have a sex life, presumably, um, there was no conjugal visits, right? He's married now, but I don't believe that there are any conjugal visits for Erik Menendez. So at this point, he's not having any, right? So the the trauma that he experienced in, especially in the sexual trauma that he experienced by Jose, is going to affect him in some way in his current sex life, right? Somehow. Whether he is conscious of the ways that it does or not, it's going to. And those are the things that they're talking about. So is it, um, if he was having sex currently with his wife, would you expect that there would be some issues in that category of his life? So that's kind of what they're talking about. And he says, yes, let me clarify on that question. There are three scales that you just identified: sexual concerns, dysfunction, sexual behavior, and tension reducing behaviors. Those are all very low. And I think the reason is simply that's because he's incarcerated and he wouldn't even have a chance to do these behaviors if he wanted to. So let's back up. Sexual concerns. So he's not having sex. So his only concern might be that he's not having any. Dysfunction, uh, dysfunctional sexual behavior. Again, we don't know because he's not having any that we know of. So that would be both. Those points would both be mute. Not mute, moot. I meant to say moot, but it came out mute. No, both of those points would be moot. And then the tension reducing behavior might be something like, well, when you're stressed, what do you do? Maybe you go find a quiet place, you sit down and you kind of just take some breaths and relax. Or maybe you got to get on the phone and call and talk about it with a friend, talk to somebody, whatever it might be. So, whatever your tension reducing behaviors are, we all have the opportunity to go out. We have the freedom to go and do whatever we want that might reduce our intention or might reduce our tension. Erik doesn't really have that opportunity when he's pretty much kept in, close quarters with other men and, just not a great situation for recovering from such traumatic events that they went through. So, anyways, he goes on to say those are all very low. And I think the reason is simply because he's incarcerated and he wouldn't even have a chance to do those behaviors if he wanted to. The other scale that's slightly below the PTSD profile is the one marked DA, defense avoidance, and I mentioned last time that that refers to the PTSD cluster of symptoms regarding avoidance and numbing and diminished responsiveness as part of the PTSD syndrome. You can look at the chart and see on DA, his score is 63, and the PTSD profile's about 69 from where I sit here. Looks like it's about 69. So he's slightly below that, and slightly below that line I mentioned before, the 65 cutoff line. Again, I think the reason for that is that his defensive avoidance around his traumatization has reduced because of the fact of the trial. That is, he's talking about himself, he's talking about the history, he's talking about the experiences that he's had, would be associated with the development of trauma symptoms. So that somewhat is below the PTSD profile, saying like doing the therapy also in prison. He's been seeing, therapists while he's in prison, and he's talking about the events that took place that he was never allowed to talk about. So just that alone can relieve some of that tension and anxiety and stress, just being able to talk about it, being able to speak your truth, being able to say, this is what happened to me. And I haven't been able to say it for all these years, and I can finally tell, even though it's hard and difficult and I don't want to relive it, but at least now, and it's out there. Um, and he had to do it twice, mind you. I believe it was 8 days on the stand in trial one and 7 days on the stand in trial two. Total 15 days. All right. So now, when you say he's talking about himself, these defensive avoidances, does that mean a tendency on the part of the traumatized person to avoid talking about the traumatic incident? Yes. And since he's in trial and has to do that, he isn't avoiding, he's dealing with it. He has to talk about it, he has to deal with it, correct. Is this particular dependency towards defensive avoidance something that can be overcome through therapy where one talks about it? Yes. Had it been noted in the research that what we call talk therapy, therapy involving talking about these problems, can someone with some of the symptoms of PTSD, such as defensive avoidance, can it help someone? Wait, that was a weird question. Has it been noted in the research that what we call talk therapy, therapy involving talking about problems, can it help with some of the symptoms of PTSD and like defensive avoidance? He says yes. Well, I'm going to talk about three of these things and go on to the other test. That this particular test that you administered was asking Mr. Menendez about symptoms that he is experiencing now, Erik Menendez. Correct. And based on your interviews with him and the other testing, do you have information that he experienced all of these symptoms before August 20th, 1989? Yes. And apart from his telling you that he experienced these symptoms before August 20th, 1989, did you discern in the materials that you were submitted to, which included testimony of witnesses and statements of witnesses and records, evidence to support his assertions that he experienced these symptoms before August 20th, 1989? Yes. With respect to the levels that are reflected on the chart, did you find a significant amount of support for the assertion that he had intrusive imagery frequently in the years preceding August 20th, 1989? Yes. Did you find evidence to support that he was off? I wish they would explain, like, give a definition of what everything is. Did you find evidence to support that he was often observed to be suffering from a very high level of anxiety and anxious arousal? Yes. And this is apart from anything he is saying, correct? Correct. Did you find evidence that both before and right after the killings of his parents, he suffered very profound depression? Yes. Is there also support for his assertion that he experienced dissociative episodes? Yes. Do you recall specifically, Dr. Wilson, with respect to what he told you, whether he described situations that a clinician would call disassociation? Yes. Did he use the word disassociation? No. And were there particular situations where he was describing things that you interpreted to be disassociation? Yes. What were they? There were several things, says the witness. One that he reported one that he reported is that there would be times when he would wake up after going to bed and find himself in a different location than where he went to sleep. It could be next to his brother's bed, it could be in a closet, and not really know exactly how he got there. And that's an illustration of the kind of disassociation process. So he would go to bed in his own bed, but wake up and find himself in other places in the house that wasn't his bed. Well, isn't that called sleepwalking? Yeah, sleepwalking is a form of dissociative activity. Uh huh, he says. Okay. Another one he reported, says the witness, was that he would have out of body experiences during what he referred to as the rogue sex. It would be in which he would see himself floating above his body. He would be above, probably to be more accurate, he would be floating above his body, going to the corner of his bedroom and looking down upon himself during this sexual activity with his father. Other forms of dissociative reaction, including seeing himself out of body, looking through the out of the closet towards his bed where the sexual activity was taking place. These are very graphic descriptions of dissociative reactions. Can you have dreams that contain disassociative material and information? Yes. If you have these, let me give you an example. If you had a dream where at the culmination of the dream, the room kept getting bigger and bigger and you kept getting smaller and smaller, is that a dissociative dream? It could be a dissociative dream. Well, do you dissociate in dreams, I guess, is the question? Yes. And did you have such a dream or dreams reported to you? Yes, repetitive dreams of that nature in which his view of himself, that is, his physical size in the dream, would alter in reference to other people in the dream, and then the physical space where he was in the dream, that is, the room in which the dream was taking place, would alter in space. So people would get large, he would get smaller, the room would get bigger, he would get smaller. These kinds of perpetual alterations are often indicative of a dissociative phenomenon. That's so sad that he had to suffer through that. It's not your opinion that he was having a dissociative episode. It's not your opinion that he was having a dissociative episode at the time of the shootings in this case, is it? No. Now, with respect to, are we done then with that particular test? Yes. Now, did you want to go through the other test to describe the significant features of his responses on those tests? Yes. Which would you like to start with? Asked Abramson. The witness says, I'd like to talk about the impact of events scale next. Ms. Abramson says, if you look at the number on those documents so the jury could follow along later if they don't want to look at them, or if they want to look at them, sorry. Sure. The number on the document, the exhibit, is 398A and B. 390A and B, alpha and beta. Okay. What was significant about his responses on the impact of events scale? There are a number of things that are significant about his responses to the impact of event scale. As I mentioned previously, the impact of event scale was administered to Mr. Erik Menendez with reference to 2 points in time. August 17th, 1995, and August 20th, 1989, actually the week before to be precise. This is a test that asks for symptoms over the preceding 7 days. Yes. So you got So you got the preceding, the 7 days to August 17th, 1995, and the preceding 7 days to August 20th, 1989? Correct. And what's significant in this scale, which is designed to measure post traumatic stress disorder clusters that have been we've been referring to. First of all, in terms of his self-reported symptoms for 1989, that he had a very high score on the intrusive subscale, that is, the intrusive re experiencing of sexual molestation, which is what the questionnaire is asking about. In fact, he got the highest score possible. In terms of the avoidance subscale, going to 1989, that he had a moderately high subscore on the avoidance cluster, but it was a lower score, a lot lower than the intrusive traumatic memory score. And then finally, well, let me stop you there, says Miss Abramson. He says, let me just finish this. The third scale, let me clean up the three scales and we can go on. The third scale was the hyperarousal scale, the D cluster of post traumatic stress symptoms, and had a very, very high score as reported for 1989 on that one, just short of the maximal score. So the three together for the 1989 periods of time, the time before August 20th showed positive post traumatic stress disorder symptomology that would qualify for a diagnosis. Number two, extremely high levels of intrusive recollections of traumatic experience. Number three, lower levels of tendencies to avoid those recollections and traumatic memories. And number four, extraordinarily high levels of reported hyperarousal that is a psychologically consistent component of the stress syndrome. Well, we know he's got that. Now, when you say he reported symptoms, did he sit there and say, I had these symptoms? No, no, not at all. The questionnaire is structured so that the person taking it reads the question and answers the question specifically as it pertains to the identified traumatic stressor event. And in this case, the identified traumatic stressor event was sexual molestation. So, what are the questions like? The witness says, let me read the first one. Any reminders that brought back feelings about it? So that's what it says. Anything brought back feelings about it? He says yes, it being the sexual molestation, and the person answers not at all, rarely, sometimes, or often. Another example, I had trouble staying asleep. Another example, other things keep making me think about it. So for each of the 22 items on the impact of event scale, the person completing the scale reads the items, answers the items in terms of the identified traumatic event, and then makes a rating of the frequency with which they've had that particular phenomenon in the last week. So this is only specifically within the last week. Okay, and those are a different set of questions than the ones, for example, that were administered on the chart 401. Yes. And yet he's showing a consistent response pattern on both. Yes. The defensive avoidance or the avoidance tendency of people, is that a tendency with people who have been traumatized through domestic violence, even if they're not clinically diagnosable as suffering from PTSD? I'm not sure what your question is. If the mechanism of trying to avoid remembering unpleasant things considered a coping mechanism, something that all people are prone to do about certain events? Yes. And is it something that the literature indicates abused children tend to do, avoid, if they can avoid thinking about traumatic events, even if they're not clinically diagnosed as suffering from PTSD? Yes. Why is it that the mind wants to avoid these things? Simply put, it's a defense reaction. It's a protective reaction against the anxiety and discomfort that the person feels about having had this experience. It's very unpleasant. One of the natural tendencies is to protect the mind, to try to push away, to shut down the feelings about it. Another way is to avoid it, not to have those. another way to avoid it is to not have those particular feelings or to try to focus on one's attention on energy somewhere else rather than one's feelings and connection to the trauma. Are some people better at avoiding in using the defense mechanism? Are some people more successful in developing that coping strategy than others? Yes. And are other people less successful? Strike that. Do people who are less successful tend to have higher anxiety symptoms? Yes. Based on the scoring and the test results that you administered to Eric Menendez here, into which group, if either, does he fall? He falls into the category of the person who has more traumatic memory and less defensive avoidance. So more anxious? More anxious, yes. All right. Is there anything that you wanted that's of significance that should be explained about the impact of events scale test? The witness says yes. She says, go ahead. He says, okay, well, when we looked at his results, when we looked at Eric's results for the period of 1995 as opposed to 1989, the level of the intrusive subscale and the traumatic memory subscale remained at the same high level as it was in 89, as he reported it, again at the maximum scale of points. So there was a consistency between his reporting for 95 and what he recalled for 89. Does that make sense? Yes. Why? Why does it make sense? Asked the witness. She says, it's been so many years. Why would he still have that same level of intrusive imagery? There are a number of reasons why he would have that same level of intrusive imagery. First of all, he's in the process of a trial which is reactivating the memories and experiences for him while he's in the process of this litigation. So that's going to stir things up. Number two, he hasn't had systemic psychotherapy specifically directed at the impact of his childhood experiences upon functioning. So there's no resolution psychologically or integration at this time of those experiences. Therefore, what I would expect is they would tend to remain high. Was this also found in the research on PTSD and the research that led, for example, Doctors Carney and Vanderkolk at Yale and Harvard, respectively, to look at the biological causes of the intrusive imagery, the most difficult symptom of PTSD to resolve in therapy? Yes, that and hypervigilance. Those were the two that were having the most trouble treating patients. So these biological changes that cause imagery, intrusive imagery, and the um, hypervigilance. So, what purely clinical therapeutic methods, with purely clinical therapeutic methods is the question? And he says correct. Well, did those seem to be intrusive imagery and hypervigilance appear to be the last symptoms that people successfully treated for PTSD seem to overcome? Yes. Were there other results of note in this test? Yeah, I wanted to say also that in the 1995 report by Mr. Eric Menendez, his avoidance subscale decreased substantially from what he reported in 89, and the hyperarousal decreased as well, but not as much as it did for the avoidance subscale. So there were some changes indicated then. In 95 on the scale, he's positive for post traumatic stress disorder, high levels of intrusive re experiencing, high levels of hyperarousal. This is 95, and low levels of avoidance. Does it appear, given the difference between the reported symptoms in 89 and the reported symptoms in 95, we'll strike that, has it been noted in treating people with PTSD who were traumatized in a domestic relationship, either as children or battered women or abused elders or whatever the specific relationship is there a tendency for those folks to get better somewhat as soon as the stressor is removed? Yes. Unlike the war veterans, say, or the disaster veterans, where the stressor is of limited duration and they're out of it at the time of the diagnosis. Has it been noted in, for example, children who are removed from abusive families or battered women who have recently left spouses that when the stressors go down, some of the symptoms just automatically go down? Correct. Is that a measure of perhaps not post traumatic stress disorder, but acute stress disorder? Yes. In other words, the stressors that are being caused by the continuation of the bad situation? That's correct. And is that different than what happens with people who have been long out of the stressful situation, such as veterans, when you don't see an automatic dropping over time? I'm not sure what you're asking. In other words, with people who have been out of the traumatic situation for a long time at that point that they're diagnosed, does the passage of time alone cause any diminution? Can't say that word. Make it diminutive. Diminution, I think is how you say that. In symptoms. Like, does anything cause them to dissipate? Isn't that like kind of diminution? I feel like I'm not saying that right. Struggling here, my brain for a second. Yeah, so it's pronounced diminution, but I was correct. It does mean like lessening or decreasing, so dissipating those symptoms is what she's talking about. He says it may or may not. It depends on how severely traumatized the person was to begin with. If the trauma was severe, it can stay chronic in a high state of arousal for many years, if not decades. So you can have that high state of arousal, but kind of um, it can remain with you for many years, decades even. But if you're out of that situation, you're not constantly triggered by it. But when you see things or hear things or smell things or whatever triggers you into the thinking about those situations, then you can go back into that state of PTSD very easily. Next question. It doesn't resolve without therapy and treatment. For many, it does not resolve at all without therapy and treatment. In the worst cases, it does not resolve without intervention. Are we done discussing the impact of event scale? Yes. What is the next test, the results, which you would like to explain? The next one is the SCL 90, which is exhibit number 379D, data symptom checklist 90. Well, let me just ask a question here. Whenever you're evaluating someone for post traumatic stress disorder and they're describing symptoms, are some of these symptoms, well, strike that. Some of these symptoms are just the thoughts that they're having. Isn't that right? Yes. No matter who they are or what the cause of the PTSD is. Yes. Is there any way to evaluate people for post traumatic stress disorder without having to rely to some extent on what they tell you what they tell you they think? So you're relying on that patient's thoughts. He says yes. He says yes, there's another way to evaluate someone without just looking at their thoughts alone. She says, how would you do that? You can do it in two ways. One is to use psychophysiological measures, and the other way is to do it as a biological assays. You get samples from blood and urine. Is that the typical way in which the diagnosis is rendered? No. And why not? The typical way, the reason it's not, and the typical way is that the person doing the evaluation for a diagnosis needs to get a trauma history. And so, to get a trauma history, it's important to talk to the person about the nature of the traumatic experiences. What is it that they experience? This is why, pay attention, judge. This is why examples of Erik's childhood should come in, examples of his trauma and abuse should come in because it is extremely important in order to diagnose, to treat, to do anything about the symptoms that you're experiencing from trauma. You have to discuss it. You have to talk about it. You have to learn about it. So That's the only way. He says, what is it that they endured? What were the nature of the sensors in the stressors of their specific traumatic event? And how did it affect them? What was the impact or consequence of those traumatic stressors to the individual? So the getting a trauma history is very critical, and generally that's gotten directly from the patient, or it may be gotten from collaterals, for example, people who might have also been in the trauma with the person at the same time, or from persons who saw the trauma survivor immediately afterwards who would be in a position to note changes in behavior from the way they were beforehand to the way that they are after it happened. Again, that's in the context of taking a trauma history. Is it possible to do biological assays? And what was the other thing you said? A psychophysiological technique of measuring post traumatic stress. Is it possible to do that with someone who's incarcerated? It's probably not possible to do it with someone who's incarcerated. Do you make any attempt to try to do that with Erik? No. Why? It would be very difficult to do to get that kind of sampling procedure for someone who's incarcerated. No. One, you have to have a controlled laboratory procedure, and in that laboratory procedure, for example, to get a urine sample or a blood sample in which you would look at the presence of certain substances such as neurohormones, you have you have to have to a controlled environment to do that. Other factors are held constant that could affect the presence of those hormones in the sample. You have to control for things like diet, you have to control for things like other stressors that potentially might exist in the person's life while you're getting that sample. So, obviously, prison is stressful. So, you have to account for the fact that he's already in a stressful situation coming into a test to evaluate stress level. So let me stop you there for a second, says Ms. Abramson. Is the fact that someone is facing capital murder charges another stressor? Undoubtedly. So he says yes, very much so. Would it make sense clinically to try to take a sample from somebody going through a trial of this type? I think it would be difficult unless you can remove them from the incarceration procedure and put them in a condition which would permit a valid and scientific test. So you can't even do the test because of their location. Are these kinds of biological tests in the experimental stage at this point? Yes. Where are these experimental tests being conducted? I'd like to know more about these tests. Did they ever take off? What's going on with them? He says they're being conducted in a number of places at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder at Yale University School of Medicine, at Harvard University School of Medicine, at the National Institute of Mental Health. There's a longitudinal program under the guidance of Dr. Frank Putnam. Well, are these all controlled research with groups of identified persons? Yes. In other words, you have people that have already been clinically identified as suffering from post traumatic stress disorder, where the histories have long been taken and where they're watched over time? Correct. So is there any way to just pick a person out of the contrary and say, go test this person who's outside the study? No. So, outside of those experimental studies, is the diagnosis of post traumatic stress disorder almost always rendered based on taking a trauma history and talking to the traumatized person? Yes. So, the answer is almost always based on talking, trauma history, and talking to the traumatized person about that trauma. Do you seek corroboration from outside sources when it's available? Yes. Okay, you were telling us about the significance of the SCL90R. Yes. The Symptom Checklist 90 is a clinical profile across 9 different psychiatric symptom clusters. Much like the profile here, it represents a graph in which there's an average score, a mean score in standardized terms, and then there's that elevation above that line 65. And then it gives us the scores for how, in this case, Erik Menendez scores match up to people who have known to have psychiatric and clinical histories across all of the scales, with the exception of hostility, which is one of the subscales. All of his subscale scores are elevated. That tells you a lot too, that he's not a hostile person. Like, he's not for confrontation, he's not hostile, he doesn't want the drama, the hostility, the violence. He doesn't want any of that. So, um that's a good thing on his a good score, that he's not above the line on that. So he's not a hostile individual. He goes on to say, which is one of the subscales, all of his subscale scores are elevated, which includes scores of somatic complaints, which is like you have a complaint, but there's no real like reason for it that a doctor can find. Somatic means like it's almost insulting, like it's all in your head, but that's kind of what it means. That you have these symptoms and your doctor doesn't know, can't originate where they're coming from. Anyways, he says, which includes scores on somatic complaints, obsessive rumination, depression, anxiety, phobia, paranoid ideation, and psychotic like symptoms, as well as the overall severity of all his symptoms reported across each one of the psychiatric subscales. This test is also designed to determine if the person who's taking the test, their scores are known as a clinical case, and in scoring his test, it qualifies as a clinical case. What that means is that his profile is at a level of elevation that matches that of a known psychiatric patient who is suffering from one or more particular psychiatric disorders, and hence it qualifies as a clinical case. So his test scores would put him on the map as a psychiatric patient suffering from multiple psychiatric disorders. Is he matched specifically to a psychiatric disorder? No, not on this particular test, he is not. So that doesn't match specifically for PTSD, but generally for psychiatric problems. Is that a fair way to put it? Yes, that's a nice way of putting it. Now you said except on hostility. Yes. What were the results on hostility? They're within the normal range. And did you mention that with respect to the first one, TSI, that one is, what is that one called? Yes. Or what is it? Did you mention that with respect to the first one? He says yes. Okay, so he also scored below the mean for irritability and anger. Yes, that's the AI score there. And his T score was 44, which is within a normal range. It's the third clinical scale over AI. Remember, AI does not mean artificial intelligence here. It means he's got abbreviations for all the different categories in which he uh, evaluates everyone. Well, it's not his evaluation necessarily, it's just the standard practice. Do you have a hypothesis of why he would score lower than other people with PTSD on irritability and anger? Yes, I have several hypotheses. What is that? First of all, that throughout his developmental history, he's been taught to check anger and irritability. It was not an emotion or expression that was functional or acceptable in the context of his family. So he probably is stunted in when it comes to feeling those particular emotions, because he was told you can't have those emotions and you can't cry. Those emotions probably are other emotions that he was, restricted from having in the house. Assuming that starts out as a willful act as someone's part to try to purposely hold back that over time, does that become automatic? Yes, it becomes a learned behavior. Was there evidence from information about his childhood that indicated he tended to be a passive rather than an angry person? Yes, that's the second point I was going to make. So just in general, he's very much more passive than um, most people probably, especially because it's a learned passiveness. He had to learn how to be passive all the time when Jose was around. Yes. Are you aware what his demeanor was over 12 days of cross-examination in this case? Yes. Are you aware that in spite of being yelled at for 45 minutes that he objection moved to strike counsel's comments, says Mr. Khan. Court says objection sustained to the form of the question. It's also irrelevant what he's aware of. Ms. Abramson says, would you expect someone with this profile where they do not, let me ask you this, when you say he was enclosed, or I'm sorry, when you say he was encouraged not to show anger over time, does that mean you don't feel it? It depends on the person. Some people can feel it, but in a more in a more private way. That is, they suppress their anger. It's there, but they don't show it. Other people learn not to express it. And in the literature, dealing with abused children and battered women who are in family relationships where they lack power and where the abusers are very aggressive, physically aggressive, and very hostile, is there clinically found in treating these people that they don't express or don't seem to feel anger towards their abusers? Yes. So these these individuals can basically treating these people like they don't express or don't seem to feel anger towards their abuser. So people who are abused can potentially, especially children who have endured it for years, can suppress those feelings of anger and resentment and hostility towards their abuser, even. They can suppress it so that they're not even angry at them for the things that they've done. Is that one of the goals of therapy with such people to try to get them to recognize that what was done to them righteously justifies anger? Objection. The witness says yes. So, okay, so part of therapy is to have them try to experience that emotion to process through what they've experienced. Mr. Khan objects. The witness says yes. Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Answer stricken, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, did you see evidence in this case that Erik Menendez did not feel anger? At what point, says the court, I was going to finish the sentence, Your Honor. All right. Towards either of his patients prior to August 20th. I said patients. I meant parents, to either of his parents prior to August 20th, 1989. He says yes. So there was. Let's read the whole sentence together. Did you see evidence in this case that Erik Menendez did not feel anger towards either of his parents before the August 20th incident? And he says yes. So Erik did not seem to have anger issues, clearly. He was very passive, very, which made him even more. I mean, Jose trained him to be that passive and to just basically put up with whatever. But it's so sad that he could do that and repeatedly get hurt by the same individual over and over again and have no anger, no feelings towards them other than I still love that person. Like that's still my dad. I get it, kind of, but not really, because things Jose did to him were, I think, unforgivable. I think anytime you harm anyone who is not capable of being able to defend themselves. Anytime you purposely seek harm on children, animals, the elderly, and anyone else, the disabled who can't, any weak link. When you pick on the weak link, it's not cool, and I don't like it. And I hate child abusers and animal abusers, like with a passion. So that's one of the reasons I do this case. In his report of his feelings about them made to, for example, Dr. Vickery, as well as yourself, did he express feeling anger towards them over the course of his childhood? Never. Never. Could you imagine the things that Jose did to that poor kid, and he's never felt anger towards him? I would. I don't know what I would do because I can't say. I've never been in his situation, but I think I'd be pretty angry. I think I would be pretty angry. I think I wouldn't want to let that feeling of anger go. But I get it. Anger is not a good feeling to have necessarily. So, it's another coping mechanism to not feel more crappy than you already feel. Next witness, did you note in Dr. Vickery's lengthy notes in his interactions with Eric Menendez that he noted after the therapy had begun any episode where Eric would even say something negative about his parents? Not that I recall. Now, you said that he scored on his particular test. You listed a series of categories. You said somatic complaints, obsessive rumination, depressive, anxiety, phobia, paranoid ideation, and psychotic what? Psychotic like thinking. And those are different scales that this measures? Yes. Did he score high in all of those? Yes, he scored very high on all of them except for hostility and phobia. I'm sorry, hostility, yes. And his paranoid ideation was somewhat lower, with the exception of hostile. They were all elevated. The highest scores are on the other scales. And do you have an opinion as to why he would score in the elevated way on phobia and paranoid ideation? Yes, because the items that he responded to tap uh, are tapping consistent that reflect. I'm just reading the words on the page, but I don't think that's the correct word there. Something about because the items that you responded to are something consistent that reflect feelings of mistrust and suspicion and guardedness at this time. Somebody feels that they need to guard themselves. Um, Also, it would tap into the feelings that perhaps there is someone who's out to get you or is persecuting you. And the phobia, of course, has to do with phobia anxiety having very specific flares and having very specific fears. Is that consistent with PTSD? Yes. And feeling mistrustful or suspicious or guarded or feeling someone is out to get you. Is that understandable if you're facing trial where the government is trying to obtain your death? Yes. Is there anything else that you found of note in the administration of this test? Yes, the other thing that I found of note is that in the diagnostic printout, it gives a breakdown of the symptoms of note, classified by those that are endorsed extremely distressed picks in and it picks each one of those items out where the respondent, the person taking the test, indicates that they felt extremely distressed and he endorsed a number of those things. What? What was significant to me is that all of them, particularly all of them, are absolutely consistent with the diagnostic criteria for the post traumatic stress disorder. There's an overlapping indicating that there that these items that he said he found, that he reported as being extremely distressed are on those that pick up virtually all the components of post traumatic stress. Now, you didn't explain to him, well, strike that. did you explain to him before administering these tests which items pointed to post-traumatic stress disorder? No. Would you do that when you were about to test somebody? No. In fact, did you, over the course of your interviewing him, ever explain to him or express to him what things he was telling you were consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder? No. Did you ever have a discussion with him concerning what is post-traumatic stress disorder? No. Did you ever discuss it with him, the difference between abuse victims who have post-traumatic stress disorder and, say, war victims or war veterans? No. Did you ever discuss with him the treatment difficulty in dealing with people with PTSD? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Saberson says, did you ever discuss with him which symptoms are most persistent versus which ones can tend to diminish over time when the stressor is removed? No. Is it is it your knowledge of that matter? Blah, 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 blah. Every time I get to about an hour in, sometimes it's earlier, my tongue just doesn't want to cooperate. I need a stretch break. Give me a minute. Just need to take a stretch, take the dogs outside, and get a little bit of a fresh perspective. So I'll be back. All right, I'm back. And I took a long break, rested up. Also had to do some PT this afternoon, so I needed to get that in anyways. So let's get back to where we were. Is your knowledge of that material, which symptoms tend to persist, which symptoms are hardest to treat based on the scientific literature? Yes. Is this, I don't know if you guys can hear that. My dogs are barking like crazy. My dog, the puppy, just barks, high pitched bark. That's his play bark. And it's just loud and incessant. They're coming up here. So we might have to pause again. Um, Is this literature that is not readily available to the public? It's not sold in the local newsstand? It's not in the local bookstores, right? You can get it off of the internet if you happen to have a computer or go to any library, sure. And it's been your understanding that Mr. Menendez has been incarcerated for 6 years and can't go to any library? It's my understanding he's been incarcerated. I don't know whether he can go to the library or not. That's the dogs playing on the bed. Hold on. Next question. Do you think they take him out and take him down to the library? I don't know, says the witness. And are you aware of the fact that his cell is subject to search at any time by the sheriff's office? Or sheriff's department, I should say. He says yes. Mr. Khan says objection, assumes facts, not in evidence. Sustained, the answer stricken. But she asked him, do you know that? And he said, yes, he does. So isn't that then a fact? I don't know how that works, but okay. Ms. Amerson says, well, you're aware of his testimony that his cell was periodically searched? Yes. Are you aware of there ever being found any literature in his cell concerning any psychological issues or abuse oh my God, I can't say issues. There we go, issues. He says, not that I'm aware of. Miss Abramson asks, now the diagnostic printout for the, I don't know why I'm having a mental block. He says the SCL90. She says, yeah, the SCL90, is this computer generated? Yes. Do you submit the results to a place that has the computer program and they generate the printout? Correct. Was there anything else of note besides the fact that it was consistent with PTSD, that printout? Was there anything else of note in the printout for the diagnostic purpose? The other thing that I would point out is the Global Severity Index, which is indicated on the computer printout profile as GSI, has a very high elevation. His score, his raw score on here, is very consistent with what I have seen in the research literature, including my own research for people who are suffering from post traumatic stress disorder. Anything else of note about that particular test? No. Do we have one more? One more. Which one was that? This is the clinician administered post traumatic stress disorder scale, or CAPS for short. Why did you choose to give him this test? I chose to give him this test because the CAP scale was developed at the National Center for Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and this is the center located in Boston, Massachusetts. There are 6 national centers for post-traumatic stress disorder. This particular center in Boston is responsible for developing instruments and tools and ways of measuring post-traumatic stress disorder and its associated features or other symptom clusters that go with it. The reason I chose this is this particular instrument has been standardized on a number of different trauma populations, ranging from Vietnam War veterans to victims of domestic violence, women who have been in the Persian Gulf, women who are victims of domestic assault or crime related post trauma stress disorder. When Ms. Abramson says, when you say woman in the Persian Gulf, which women? Well, who suffered in the military during the Persian Gulf? They had a high incidence of psychological problems upon return. Not a high, says the witness. The prevalence was around 9.8% for those who were in the theater of the Persian Gulf. Why were you selected as a group to study? In the past, women veterans have not been studied. So it was a desire? You mean the Vietnam women, the nurses and such, weren't studied? Correct. Okay, go on. Okay, this is a standardized instrument now that's been developed by the National PTSD Center, so I chose it for that basis. Secondly, it's a structured protocol. By that I mean that the person who gives the test administers it by reading the protocol. That is, there's a series of questions that are answered, that are asked, and then they look at the answer of the respondent, and then that answer is identified and then codified, that is, scored in terms of the frequency or intensity of that particular symptom, if it exists, if it's reported. And then there's the opportunity to explore further with the person to probe to see if there are any other responses for each and every symptom cluster of post traumatic stress disorder, whether or not they currently have that symptom or whether or not they've had it in the past. So the instrument yields both a current and a lifetime diagnosis of symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder. Number 2, it also allows the person using the protocol to determine whether or not the person meets either currently or lifetime the diagnostic criteria for post traumatic stress disorder. And so, using the protocol in a structured and standardized way, one can see whether or not the person is responding with answers that qualify as a symptom of post traumatic stress disorder. And also, there are associated features to PTSD that are inquired about in CAPS. These are not symptoms in the diagnostic manual, but they're symptoms that have been identified in the literature as commonly connected to PTS, post-traumatic stress. These likewise are administered. So at the end of the administration, one's able to have a summary sheet which indicates for each of the symptom clusters of PTSD and the associated features, which whether or not they meet the diagnosis, and if so, what's the intensity and frequency of their symptoms for current and lifetime functioning, and what are the other kinds of features that the report associated with the syndrome. Ms. Abramson says, okay. What were the findings? What were your findings as a result of that test? He says the findings are that based on the CAPS that Mr. Erik Menendez meets the current lifetime diagnosis For PTSD overall, across all the symptom areas, he scores in the upper end of the range. That is, in the more severe end of the symptom range, both in terms of frequency and intensity, and also in terms of the associated features, with the exception of one feature known as homicidality. He qualifies in terms of survivor guilt, guilt over acts of commission or omission, feelings of disillusionment with authority, feelings of hopelessness, memory impairment, forgetfulness, sadness and depression, and feelings of being overwhelmed. What does homicidality mean in this context? Specifically, in this context, it means, have there been times when you felt like seriously harming or even killing someone? Is this different from how you were before the event or events? How often have you felt this way in the past month? And then also asks, at their worst, how strong were these feelings of wanting to harm or kill someone? Miss Abramson asks, and on those scales, he registered below the PTSD normal? Well, this is an associated feature that is not PTSD related to the criteria. Well, how do you know he's below a normal on the associated feature? He reports 0. He doesn't report any of it whatsoever. Is it common, though, that some people with PTSD do report these feelings of wanting to kill people? Yes. How is that understood? Why is that associated with PTSD? It's associated with PTSD and often is referred to as rage at the source or anger at what happened to oneself in terms of victimization or traumatization. Frequently, they feel they've been victimized, have fantasies of retaliation, a wish to even the score. They may be interested in payback. They may want to do to the person what was done to them. These are feelings of anger and rage that may rise to the level of having homicidal fantasies, homicidal wishes, homicidal feelings, especially towards the person they perceive to be responsible for their pain and suffering or injury. Hmm. Are these the kinds of feelings and fantasies that therapists try to elicit from people who have been abused so they can feel anger? I don't know if I would use the word elicit. I think a therapist would certainly want to help the patient to deal with these feelings and emotions if they come up, but I don't know they actively go about eliciting these kinds of responses in patients. When patients have these feelings, is that considered appropriate or if they have been victimized? Yes. Are having fantasies of this kind considered a sort of healthy relief? Mr. Khan says, objection, irrelevant, sustained, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, are fantasies of this type considered therapeutic? Objection, irrelevant, sustained. Ms. Abramson says, what is the significance of people who have been victimized having fantasies like this? What is the psychological significance? Objection, irrelevant. The court says, in what context? Ms. Abramson says, well, you've talked about certain things that people do in response to trauma, like avoidance or disassociation. So is this a mechanism to cope? Yes. This doesn't mean that people are going to kill people. Correct. It's a coping mechanism where you imagine taking out the threat, perhaps. If you are in an abusive situation, it's not like you're necessarily going to act on it, but anywho. So this doesn't mean that people are going to kill people. Correct. In the literature dealing with sexually abused children, is there ordinarily found a rather high level among those who haven't killed anybody of this kind of fantasy of a coping mechanism? Sure. So a lot of children who have been, or well, probably adults who were abused as children have these fantasies of or had these fantasies of taking out their abuser, but they didn't act on it. Is the point. So many people have these fantasies, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you act on it. In your examination of Eric Menendez and the way that he tested over all these charts, was it consistent with the way he tested for lack of hostility and lack of anger that he reported he did not have these fantasies? Yes. What is consistent with the information that you had about the way in which the family was run, that he wouldn't have obvious feelings of anger or rage or hostility? Yes. Can there be situations within families when it is too dangerous to feel anger? Yes. And when bad things happen to people and they don't feel anger towards others, does that anger often get directed inward into the form of depression? Yes, and it can also go another direction. What other direction? Sometimes it gets acted out. It can lead to behavioral disturbance or a conduct problem, rebelliousness, like maybe robbing some homes in the neighborhood, promiscuity, drinking, delinquency, being late for, not showing up to school, problems with authority, acting up in class, those kinds of things. To me, I don't think Eric did anything other than perhaps be a little bit rebellious when he went and robbed those homes. But in reality, Jose wasn't mad about him robbing the homes. He was mad that he got caught with the Calabasas burglaries. He was only mad he got caught, not that he actually did the crimes. So people become depressed and others act out in other ways not directed at the source? Correct. Did you note in all the material that you examined concerning Eric any acting out behavior in class, any schoolyard bullying, anything like that? Objection irrelevant. Sustained as to the form of the question. You reviewed all of his school records? Correct. Did you ever see any indication he was a discipline problem in school? Objection irrelevant. Evidence code 352. Rephrase the question? Why can't she ask that? Did you ever find anything indicating that he was doing what you just described with respect to his school records, being rebellious, acting up in class, having difficulty with teachers or school people as authority figures? Mr. Khan says objection, irrelevant, evidence 352, and the court says overruled. You can answer the question. The witness says there is one minor incident in a choir record from the Princeton Day School in which the choir teacher noted that Eric was sometimes a little disruptive during choir practice and made a note that he wished that he would not do that. That's the only thing that I found of all the records. So he talked in class. Big whoop. Miss Amerson says, and those were going on all the way to grammar school? Correct. So he saw all of his records going back to grammar school, and there was only that one incident of him talking in class or whatever, being disruptive, which I find if he was talking a lot in class as the teacher was trying to teach, then the teacher would think he was disruptive for sure. So anyway, so is that the kind of thing that you meant, being noisy at choir practice? Mm, yeah, that was the next question. He says no. Well, have you seen school records of people who have persistent patterns of rebelling and being disrespectful and getting into fights at school and those kinds of things that attributed to a reaction against an abusive background? Objection, irrelevant, sustained. Did you find any evidence in any of the supporting materials that Eric Menendez was a drinker of a drug user or a drug user? Objection, irrelevant, sustained. He can't get any of this in and is really obnoxious. Or she, I mean, Ms. Abramson can't get any of it in because Mr. Khan keeps objecting. Ms. Abramson says, are drinking and drug abuse often outcomes for abused children? The court says, he's already answered the question. No, he hasn't. And Mr. Khan says, objection. Ms. Abramson says, have you finished telling us everything of significance concerning this test? No. All right, what else was significant? The witness says, the other thing I'd like to say that was significant about this test was that there is also a validity measurability into the test, and that is there's an instruction to the clinician in administering the instrument to determine whether or not the answers sound suspicious or questionable in terms of their reliability or whether they sound inappropriate or not consistent with what's known about post traumatic stress or the report of it by a patient. Where that's the case, the clinician is instructed to indicate that they think there's questionable validity to one of the statements that's been made. So that gives us a kind of internal check and summary way of quantifying whether or not, in the view of the administrator of the test, the person is being truthful or reporting symptoms related to their experiences that sound valid. And in this instance, there was no indication of an invalid response by Erik Menendez, so that's number one. The second thing in response to your question was that I also wanted to use this instrument as a cross check on the other measures, and using all four measuring the trauma symptom inventory, the CAPS, the SLC 90, and the impact of events scale all showed consistent results, and that was important to me because it showed that across different types of measures, this one self report comparing trauma symptoms, the impact of events scale looks at particular types of responses in his memory of sexual molestation. The clinician administered PTSD scale and the SCL 90 all dovetail their conclusions and their findings, and in that regard, I think it added a great deal of validity as well as specific types of symptoms that were diagnosed and manifested by Erik Menendez's response to these instruments. Thank you. Is that it on the testing? Yes, says the witness. Now, we were talking earlier on in your testimony about the symptom clusters for PTSD. Yes? And you indicated that there's also another diagnosis of battered person syndrome that you could make in this case? Uh-huh, yes. And that's an area that, although it may be probed for on some of the tests, it isn't yet within the symptom clusters in the DSM-4 for PTSD. That's correct. Yet those symptoms are considered part of battered person syndrome? Yes. Those had to do with what? They have to do with self concept, self reference, feelings of self worth, feelings of personal identity, feelings of self confidence. It has to do really more with a person's own sense of who they are as a human being and as a person. So, when we put it into context of battered person's syndrome, whether or not we're really referring to how the person's sense of themselves has been affected by the nature of the experiences that they've had in an abusive relationship, so that one of the consequences in battering situations or interpersonal abusive situations in which there's violence or emotional abuse or forms of psychological maltreatment is that the person's sense internally of who they are can be adversely affected. They feel very poorly about themselves. They have low self esteem, have a very low opinion of themselves, feel very confused in terms of their own identity, maybe feel they're not quite a whole person. Parts of them are split off in one way or another, feel very depressed and hopeless about whether or not they're ever going to be able to do anything with themselves in life. These are the kinds of things we're referring to in terms of more psychological consequences of damage to the self structure of the individual, damage to their internal ego states. How do you measure whether or not an abuse situation has caused this kind of negative self reference or bad feelings about themselves or worthlessness? Objection irrelevant in Evidence Code 352. Sustained, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, you've indicated that you view this is as part of battered person syndrome symptomology, correct? Correct. And you've told us about the kind of things that correlate to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder? Yes. What kind of things correlate to this? How do you know someone is going through this? Objection irrelevant, says Mr. Khan, and the court says also vague. Ms. Abramson says, did you make a determination as to whether or not Erik Menendez was or has a very negative self-reference? Yes. Objection irrelevant. Sustained to the form of the question. It's irrelevant also. Why? It's part of his report, his testing. Ms. Emerson says, did you determine, thank you, did you determine whether or not he had a negative self-reference as of August 20th, 1989? Objection irrelevant. Unless it's connected to some diagnosis that reflects his mental state at that time, it's irrelevant, says the court. Ms. Emerson says, I'm going to try. In your opinion, was Erik Menendez's sense of himself, his self-image of himself, of significance in determining the events of the week before August 20th? Objection irrelevant. Evidence Code 352. The court says sustained as to the form of the question. The court just does not want any of the abuse stuff in. Ms. Abramson says, well, Your Honor, it's 12:25. If we're going to take a recess, perhaps we can take this so I'll understand better. The court says, okay, sure. Ms. Abramson says, thank you. The court says, we'll take a recess and we'll resume in 10 minutes to the hour. Don't discuss the case with anyone. Don't form any final opinions about it. And we'll resume at 15 minutes to. Counsel will remain. So the jury leaves, and now we're going to have some arguments outside the presence of the jury. The court says, okay, the jury has left. Do you wish to be heard? Ms. Abramson says, yes, Your Honor. I thought that, let me just say where this is going. I think this may be the easiest way to do it, to indicate that this negative self-reference information that Dr. Wilson has to do with the issue of why Erik Menendez was not in a position to simply walk out of his family or to leave or to weigh that as a viable alternative, why he felt trapped, why he had so limited a view of what his opinions were. But obviously, I'm not going to ask it in terms of the witness stating the ultimate conclusion, but only whether or not a person with this kind of thought process, whether it's consistent that they would feel thus and the other. The court says, what does this have to do with diagnosis? Saberson says it has to do with diagnosis for battered person syndrome. I think it's a crucial part of that diagnosis that you have this negative self view, even if it isn't a crucial part of the PTSD. The court says, what does battered person syndrome have to do with mental state at the time of the crime that isn't already established by his testimony regarding post-traumatic stress disorder? Ms. Abramson says, I think it has more to do with the behavior of the preceding week, for which the client was rather severely criticized during cross examination, and his credibility about his feeling trapped and unable to leave, and why he felt he had no options, and how he thought about himself. I think it's relevant for that, to rebut assumptions that he's lying about how helpless he felt. The court says this is just the witness saying the man told me he felt helpless. If he felt helpless, this is why he couldn't have done something. Ms. Emerson says, I think it has to do with the fact not that he expressed helplessness. That's precisely not what he wanted to do. He expressed a view of symptoms that's typical of people who have been in battered persons relationships and feel helpless to do anything about them. The court says, what's the people's opinion? Mr. Khan says, yes, I think we should bear in mind we're now on the fourth day of direct examination, something the court can take under consideration under Evidence Code 352 and decide when enough is enough. When are we going to get to the point? Counsel has a very broad way of getting back into the entire history of the defendant, explaining battered person syndrome, post traumatic stress disorder, all of the elements of those two alleged disorders, or whatever this witness will call them. And he also explained concepts of learned helplessness as well. At a certain point, I think we reach the point where the court can say, under Evidence Code 353, the emotional impact of his experiences upon him, which is, I think, where counsel is seeking to go now into the psychological effects upon him, which have nothing to do with the specific case of mm, the specific state of mind at the time of the commission of the crime, is simply not sufficiently relevant, particularly in light of the testimony the court has already allowed. So the court can say under Evidence Code 352, this evidence should be excluded. The court says, all right, anything further? That's not a good sign, I don't think, when you give all these heartfelt arguments to the judge and then he's like, all right, anything further? Like, are you done before I scold you like the baby you are? Mr. Khan says, no, nothing further. Court says, I just don't see how this evidence is relevant at this point. You've got the diagnosis, and it's hard to determine what it is you're going to do with the diagnosis with the rest of his testimony. Samerson says, well, we're going to do a few other things before we get to that. If the court is referring to the last week, which we will get to, but we had not testified, he had not, no, we had not testified during the common misperception. Where did I get testified? We had not finished doing the common misperception discussion, which I'd like to get back to. I don't know where that word testify came from. Testify. And then we'll get to the last week. The court says, okay. Ms. Amerson says, and other issues. The court says, I'll hear the other questioning, but the line of questioning you embarked upon when we took the recess really is just asking the witness to summarize what it is that the defendant told him and then characterize it in some other way that doesn't require expert testimony. Ms. Abramson says, I wasn't going to ask him to summarize. It was actually just one or two questions. I'm not going to fight with you over it, Judge. It's just not important. The court says, all right, we'll take a recess and resume at 1:45. So they leave. The court says, okay, we have everybody present and we will resume with the examination. Bring the jury out, please. The court says, you may continue your cross-examination. Ms. Abramson says, thank you. She says, last week, Dr. Wilson, we were discussing what are called common misperceptions about the children who are in abusive family environments, and you talked about one of those common misperceptions is that children who are abused would talk about it, would tell people. Do you remember that? I do. Has there been, in fact, extensive literature and research on a number of researchers by a number of researchers on why it is that children don't report abuse? Yes. So, has there been extensive literature by researchers um, why the children don't report? He says yes. So, close in time to when it occurs? Yes. And are you specifically familiar with the works of a particular researcher, Dr. Judith Herman? Yes. And she one among many who have studies of particularly uh, incest victims? Yes. And are there particular aspects of the incest experience that are somewhat different from children who are molested by strangers? Yes. And is that the whole scope of the nicest experience that Dr. Herman and others have been researching for a number of years? Yes. With respect to his misperception that sexually molested children in incest relationships would report it, what are the findings in the psychological research community about why That is a misperception why children, in fact, don't report it. They don't report it for a number of different reasons. First of all, if they don't report it because they're afraid people won't believe them, that if they yell about these experiences they've had, been that have been so upsetting to them, so difficult, the other people simply won't believe that that's true, that it happens, that it takes place in terms of families, between parents and their children, fathers and daughters, mothers to sons, Kitty and Lyle, fathers to sons, Jose and both your kids, and so forth. Makes me wonder if Kitty was doing anything with Erik, but I think it would have come out in trial, so I don't think so. I don't know. Maybe it's who knows. Is there something specific about the nature of being a child that makes children feel that way? Yes, I mean the children is in a subordinate, submissive position relative to the power of the parent. Okay. What are the other reasons? Lack of. You told us lack of. What they were that they would be believed? What else? Well, the other ones include a sense of shame and guilt, that they feel ashamed and embarrassed and perhaps guilty about what's happened and don't want to report it. And those feelings or shame and guilt and often humiliation or embarrassment are also taken place in the context of what Herman calls the principle of secrecy. And that is what there is a pact that's made between the perpetrator and the child not to reveal the secret relationships that they've had. So the secrecy principle typically involves threats that are implied on they're implied in one form or another. Threats to the child if they tell, certain bad things will happen to them, or threats to the child in a sense that if there is a disclosure of the secret that they uh, that that the parents will go away and the child won't get the love. Sorry, I lost my place there. Or the child won't go get affection, or the child won't get material things, or it can be the kind of threat that if the child tells, someone else may leave their life. Their mother may go away, or it may be the threat to if, uh, I don't know, it could be the threat if they tell that they will be killed or they will be injured or there could be harm to someone else. So the experience of shame and humiliation and confusion, as well as the taking place within the context of the secrecy principle, which then addresses another component about why they don't tell. And and that has to do in many cases with the nature of the family dynamics. What do you mean by that? Well, what the research literature shows is the incest families typically are enmeshed families. Enmeshed? Enmeshed. It means fused, in which there is a lot of isolation of the family members from the outside world, so it's like there is a wall around the family. Things that take place in the family don't go outside the family. So, enmeshment means there is the tight sort of fusion of relationships in the family, but it's understood that the children are not to talk about what goes on in this tightly knit, enmeshed family. And does that mean just to not talk about the incest or not to talk about anything? By enmeshed, not to talk about anything, that there is sort of like a wall around the family, and what goes on in the family stays inside the family. It doesn't get out. And the isolation of the family for most is part of what Dr. Herman has identified as the family constellation. And typically, it's the perpetrator who is the one who is creating the isolation, keeping the child away from others, keeping other family members from having contact with a lot of friends or people on the outside so that the perpetrator can maintain control and power, also force secrecy at the same time. So that's another component to the witty child. The witty? Is that what I said? I don't know where I got that. So that's another component to why the child is reticent or reluctant to talk about what's happened to someone on the outside. If you grow up in an enmeshed family, do you have relationships with people outside of trust where you would even consider telling them? Generally not. In enmeshed families, the child is very reluctant, even they haven't been they haven't been abused, to talk about what goes on in the family. And was there information in this case going from sources other than Erik that his was a family in which the children were specifically instructed not to talk about anything outside the family? Yes, there is information from relatives. Do you have in mind which relatives? Sure. Teresa, Carlos, and Marta, and Marianne Cano, and Andy Cano. Okay. Are you familiar with the statement of Diane Vandermolen concerning when she lived in the house, family house? Yes. Are you familiar with her information that she too, along with the children, were instructed never to talk about even such things as tennis practice or grades? Yes. And is that evidence to you of a high level of secrecy and enmeshment in this family? Yes, it is. Are you aware of other witness statements as talking about the four Menendez family members as being separate and apart from Lyle? Yes. As a very difficult family to penetrate? Yes. And do you remember the information like that was coming from people? A family called Goldsmith, where the children grew up for many years in contact with the Menendez family. There are three Goldsmiths: Faith, Peter, and husband, and her daughter Jessica. In fact, so- in fact, Jessica had specific statements. I was going to say something about it, and just never mind. Not even worth it. In fact, Jessica had specific statements about secrecy being maintained in the family, specifically with reference to Mr. Erik Menendez's placement in grade level. She was unaware that he had repeated the fifth grade and also gone to a special school in 1986. Do you remember information from the Goldsmiths that the Menendez family, when you were around them, it was clear that you were not invited or included? Yes. Now, did in Herman's research and the research of others who studied incest families, is there also literature that supports the notion that within these families there also isn't much communication between the parents and the children? Are you sure what you mean by communication? Or I'm not sure. The communication tends to be talked down. What do you mean talked down? The flow of the communication goes from the authoritative stance of the parents to the children. In other words, there's not an open, free exchange of ideas or feelings or discussion. That basically, the parents set the agenda about what's going to be taught. And more specifically, what Dr. Herman has found is that the perpetrator is usually the one who is trying to control the communication flow within the family so that the perpetrator maintains control over the lines of communication. So it usually comes down in a rather, what she found was an authoritarian, um, domineering pattern of interaction between the perpetrator and all the other family members. Is there evidence in this case from multiple sources that that's precisely the way Jose Menendez ran his family? Yes. And is there information that these sources that he would say and do that kept the family members from getting closer to each other, even within the four members of the family? Did he do things to keep people from getting closer to one another? Yes. Do you remember any specifics of that kind of divide and conquer? Well, one example is where Jose indicated to Eric that his mother wasn't his friend, meaning Eric's friend, but his mother was father's friend. And that's a kind of example here where there is an attempt to solidify the bond between the mother and the father and to make a division between the parents and the child, between Kitty and Jose. Started at, what did he say, 6 years old? It doesn't say. Why did I think he was 6? I don't know. Anyways, did you have information from the testimony of witnesses as well as witnesses of people who viewed the family, such as coaches and teachers, that Mrs. Menendez appeared to be, if you will, the day-to-day enabler of Mr. Menendez's authoritarian style of child rearing? Objection, irrelevant, and under Evidence Code Section 352. The court says sustained. Ms. Abramson says, would the fact that a mother does not take any, never criticizes an authoritarian of Aryan parent father style, never intercedes, but in fact is the person who carries out all the orders, and is the that an isolating factor in a family like this? Mr. Khan says objection irrelevant. The court says sustained. Ms. Abramson says, is there evidence here that Mrs. Menendez ever shared a sense of victimization, a sense of Eric's victimization with her? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, is there in the literature the proposition that if children who are abused have any adult figure who commiserates, who is emotionally supportive, that can minimize the impact of the abuse? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Your Honor, I would like to be heard. The court says, all right, let's move on to something else, please. Ms. Abramson says, we were talking about the common misperception of children reporting in the sense of internal isolation in the family, one of the other contributors to a failure to report. Mr. Khan says, objection, of course, irrelevant. The court says, I think he's already said this, hasn't he? Ms. Abramson says, is encouraging. Oh, doesn't end there. Is encouraging competition among the family members another way of causing isolation that leads to failure to report? Mr. Khan says, objection, irrelevant, and evidence code 352. Court says sustained. Ms. Amerson says, I'd like to be heard on that as well, Your Honor. The court says, all right, let's move on to something else. See how she never gets to be heard? She always is asking for sidebars, and the judge tells her, move on to the next question. Whereas her co-counsel, or was it Levin or Gessler? It doesn't matter. Either one of them could stand up there and do the exact same things that Ms. Abramson is doing in the court, and they wouldn't be told to stop, I'm sure. They'd probably be pranking the office phone or pranking people from the office phone if I were to take a guess. Abramson says, now you also indicated that one of the most common methods of preventing reporting is the use of threats. Yes. And in this particular case, looking over the information, were there a number of different kinds of threats that were made to Eric Menendez by his father? Yes. And do you have in mind any significant threats that would discourage reporting? Yes. And what are those? Objection irrelevant and under Evidence Code Section 352. All right. As to the specific instances sustained, says the court. Ms. Amerson says, specific kinds of threats? Court says, all right, in a general sense, Is that what you're asking? Ms. Abramson says, well, I'm asking not in a general sense with respect to the case, specific kind of threats that would be meant to discourage reporting. The court says you're asking for examples or just types of threats. Types of threats, Your Honor. Do you understand the question? Says the court. The witness says, I'm trying to get it clear, Your Honor. The court says, okay. Ms. Amerson says, well, do you have any opinion that there were types of threats made in this case that contributed to the failure to report or could have contributed to the failure to report? Yes. And what were those types of threats? There are various types of threats, which include threat of personal injury, such as being beaten, threats of being killed, threats of killing others or loved pets if there was reporting of the abuse, threats of loss of affection and love if there was a report. And there are the principal kinds of threats. These are the principal kinds of threats. And last week, we were also talking about one of the other common misperceptions that abused children run away. Were there also threats geared at avoiding what was happening or avoiding that from happening? Avoiding threats to Erik if he tried to run away, basically, is what she's trying to say. He says yes. And what kind of threats were those? The threat that you can't run away, that if you try to run away, that you will be found, and if you are found, you will be punished. Was there information that you are aware of that Mr. Menendez tried to portray himself to Erik Menendez as someone capable of killing someone? Yes. And would that strengthen any threats? Certainly. So that if he going into that night, August 20th, 1989, if he already is going into that with the mindset that Jose is capable of killing someone, and he's already threatened me, and he's threatened to kill whoever I tell, that means that's how they got to the conclusion that they were basically a target for Jose that night when they were or they weren't, we don't know. We don't know what they were doing in that room. They weren't sitting and watching TV like the state wants us to believe. They could have been plotting something or figuring out something to deal with them. I'm pretty sure that's probably what they were doing after their conversation that night. So again, basically the the whole point of my tangent was if you go into that night thinking that person could kill people, not only kill people, but threaten to kill me, threaten to kill whoever I tell, then yeah, you're going to go into that night thinking you need to protect yourself after the week that you've had, especially with all the stress and tension and everything. So I don't think it's an irrational thought. It's definitely irrational to us, but for people that are in that situation, I don't think it was an irrational thought for them to try to eliminate the 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 thing that they were afraid of, the thing that was most fearful, that they were most fearful of. Next question is, and is there information from other witnesses that Mr. Menendez bragged of his ability to get people killed? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, I'd like to be heard on that, Your Honor. All right. Whoa, really? Ms. Abramson says, is also the carrying out of threats such as beating someone after you believe after strike that, such as a perpetrator beating an incest victim after the perpetrator learns that the or believes the incest victim has talked. Is that the kind of behavior that reinforces threats to kill? Yes. Do you have information that occurred in this case? Yes. Would strike that. Dr. Wilson, are all incest situations ones in which violence are used, or is that only some of the families? It's only some of the families. Is it even necessary to use, based on the research, is it even necessary to use violence to get children to appear to be compliant with incestuous behavior? Objection irrelevant. Rephrase the question, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, based on the research, has it been shown that children who are non physically resistant, non runaway, and non reporting of incest, even when there has not been physical violence? Yes. When there is physical violence in theory, does that make reporting and running away even less likely? Yes. Any correlation between the severity of the psychological effects of incest and the persistence or lack of violence accompanying the sex acts? Mr. Khan says, objection irrelevant. The court says, rephrase the question. Ms. Abramson says, okay. Have there been studies dealing with the depth of psychological damage to children who are molested without violence versus those who are molested with violence? Objection irrelevant, sustained. This is unbelievable. You should be able to bring this stuff in. You have to be able to explain the psychological effects of abuse but you can't do it using any real life situation or experiences with the defendant. This makes no sense. Ms. Abramson says, is it commonly understood that physical violence by itself can cause psychological damage? Yes. Is it commonly understood that sexual molestation, even without physical violence, can cause psychological damage? Yes. Is there any correlation between the level of violence in a sexual setting and the degree of impairment? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Do you have an opinion as to why Erik Menendez's symptoms of PTSD are as severe as you found them to be? Yes. What is that opinion? My opinion is that his symptoms are so severe as they are because he was subjected to repeated episodes of sexual molestation by his father. Did violence make any difference in your assessment? Yes. What difference did it make? It made a difference in the sense that not only were there acts of sexual molestation, there were acts of not only were there acts of sexual molestation, there were acts of sexual molestation that involved physical violence, hitting, slapping, pulling of the hair, threats with a knife, and other forms of physical threats, in particular, in which objects would be used sexually with his body, ropes, tacks, pins, other things of this type, which specifically refer to the potential for physical injury. So, yes, it's both the sexual molestation and the combination of repeated physical assaults or the threat of assaults. Can the mere threat of an assault be as damaging as an actual assault? Objection, irrelevant, overruled. Yes, just knowing that it's coming could make you more nervous. As Averson says, when you talked about one of the symptoms, the symptom cluster of trauma, you talked about a fourth category of this negative self reference that's prevalent among people who suffer from battered person syndrome, correct? Correct. Does a negative self reference also translate into a person thinking nobody would care about them? Objection, irrelevant. I'm not finished with the question, says Ms. Abramson. Wouldn't care about bad things that were happening to them? Objection, irrelevant, and under evidence code 352. Uh, sustained, of course, says the court. Ms. Abramson says, and is a sense that no one would care if bad things had happened to them one of the reasons research shows why children don't report? Yes. Now, is there another common misperception that children who are being, strike that children who are being sexually molested get used to it so that it doesn't bother them anymore? Yes. Is that true? No. If someone had been victimized as an incest victim over a long period of time, does the threat of another sexual assault is that okay with the victim? Is that something that would not cause an emotional response? Mr. Khan says objection, calls for speculation. The court says rephrase the question. Is there any way, says Ms. Abramson, to believe, based on the literature, that threats of subsequent sexual activity made to an incest victim has no emotional impact? Objection irrelevant, overruled. The witness says, as I understand the question, no. Ms. Abramson says, what does the literature indicate about subsequent threats of sexual contact? The literature indicates that with subsequent threats of sexual contact, especially in the context of an incest relationship, that there is heightened ear response. There is heightened anxiety, there is heightened trepidation, and really the generation of dual tendency between fright and flight. On the one hand, I see why he's on the stand for so many days because he's a talker, like Carrie from Boston, or not Boston, but Delphi, Massachusetts. Boston just sounds better with Boston accent. On the other hand, wanting to remove themselves from the situation to get out of what they think is going to happen, or on the other hand, to become very anxious, very aroused, knowing that that experience is soon to take place. And does this literature that the conflict um, does the literature indicate that the conflict, in fact, the emotional turmoil his that this causes gets worse as the child gets older? Irrelevant. Objection. Overruled. The witness says yes. Miss Abramson says, now, is there believed to be in the psychological community that deals with sexual molestation of children a very high level of underreporting of sexually abused by boys, sexual assaults on boys? Yes. And is there an understanding of why this is? There is. And what is it? There is a several button that uh, the boys tend to underreport in comparison. Male boys as opposed to female girls, and that is number one, a gender difference. Boys are less likely to report these things. That's part of their socialization of boys. What do you mean by the socialization of boys? The way that they're brought up, the expectation about being a boy or being a male in our culture. Well, specifically, what is the social this blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry. I need to pause again. Hold on. Well, specifically, what is the socialization of males that lead to the to not report? What is the expectation? So what causes them to not report? An expectation is that they wouldn't report, that they wouldn't be expressive of these kinds of feelings, that it would be indicative of weakness on the part of the boy or the other child to report such a thing. In other words, victimization is weakness for males? Yes. Is that a problem that was encountered in dealing with Vietnam War vets also, that they didn't want to perceive themselves as victims? Objection, irrelevant. Sustained. Ms. Abramson says, to go on, we were talking about understanding or beliefs as to why males don't report. And you just told us about one gender specific based on socialization. Are there others? Yeah, says the witness. I mean, the other has to do with the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that if they tell, they won't be believed. That is kind of the thing that is that this kind of thing actually happens to them. People don't believe it. So there is this tendency to censor themselves in terms of what's happened to them and their willingness to report it to other people. Okay. Now, did you, Mr. Wilson, or Dr. Wilson, sorry, Dr. Wilson, based on the diagnosis that you formed in this case, did you also form an opinion as to what Eric Menendez's mental state was at the time of the shooting? Yes. What was that opinion? Objection, Evidence Code, Section Penal Code, Section 29. Sustained. Abramson says, did you form an opinion as to whether there was a relationship between PTSD and his mental state at the time of the crime? Yes. And what, in your opinion, is that relationship? The relationship between his PTSD and the crime is that one, his post traumatic stress disorder was the product of prolonged and repeated sexual molestation for many years, beginning in his childhood at age 6 and continuing to age 18. As a consequence of that post traumatic stress disorder, there was an effect of his behavior. There was an effect on his psychological functioning. And specifically, the effect had to do with him becoming very hypervigilant to cue that signified the potential reoccurrence of further victimization or re-traumatization by his father. And well, is that specific to the reoccurrence of sex or the reoccurrence of other forms of trauma as well? It's both. Okay. And apart from hypervigilance, was there other parts of the PTSD on his functioning at that time? Yes, there are many different consequences of his post traumatic stress disorder to his functioning. One is that it impacted how he feels about himself, that he didn't see himself as an assertive person that had options, that had a lot of choice in his life at that particular time. He saw himself as vulnerable and fragile in regards to his father. That is to say, that there wasn't a way for him to stand up to his father or to discuss a different way that he might try to get what he wanted in his life at that point in time, which was to go away to college and not have the sexual molestation continue. So that's another way of saying that one of the consequences of his PTSD is that he had a very passive, helpless orientation in terms of his relationship, specifically with his father, that he saw him as this powerful, dominant, controlling, and fearful, threatening person, and that's part of this consequence. And so the effect of this PTSD is to heighten his sense of sensitivity to signs of threat by his father. It cues in behavior that would indicate to him that he was going to be subjected to another experience of sexual molestation, violence, or emotional maltreatment at that time. So it cues the behavior that would indicate that he was going to be harmed again, that he was going to be traumatized again. Now, with respect to that symptom cluster that you've talked about under the hyperarousal, okay? Yes, that's the doctor. What part, if any, do you believe that played? What was the relationship between that and the mental state at the time of the shootings? I'm a little unclear on what your question is. Well, let me just refer you to something that we have discussed. Do you remember the research that was done by Bessel van der Kolk out of Harvard? Yes. That's the Mind Body Connection book that I told you guys I have, that I didn't even realize I read it for my own personal reasons, and then I didn't even realize until I saw that name in the book, and I was like, wait a minute, I think I have that one. So that is an older book. I have my books right here, but I can't find it. Anyways, so that particular person wrote a book about the mind-body connection and how your body remembers trauma and holds trauma in itself and can manifest into physical ailments and things of that nature. So that's kind of what that book's about. So she says, do you remember the research that was done by Bessel van der Kolk out of Harvard? He says, yes. And talking about what happens when people who, as you've called it, whose idle screws are turned up, yes, are presented with cues or signs that trauma is going to happen. Yes. How they react to it? Yes. Okay. So, how does that notion of hyperarousal, which you have described as the idle screw being turned up, does that have any relationship, or does that then form the relationship between Eric Menendez having PTSD and the occurrence of the shootings in this case? Yes. And what is that linkage, in your opinion? The linkage is as follows. The linkage is that we already have the idle screw turned up. This is the hypervigilance and Eric Menendez's post-traumatic stress disorder state. Now, in terms of, if I understand your question correctly, referring to August 20th, or, well, let's not get to the specifics just yet, says Ms. Abramson. We will. But just in general, what happens when someone who has this, okay, says the witness, all right. When we have when the hypervigilance is there, when the idle screw is turned up, so you're a nervous wreck pretty much all the time, one of the consequences is that the person goes from responding to stimulus, responding to a situation where they perceive a threat cue. They go from that to a response tendency, bypassing what would normally be a more reflective, thoughtful appraisal process where they try to evaluate and assess what's happening. Another way of saying this is, in very simple terms, is they go into overdrive. They go into automatic pilot. They become emotionally overwhelmed so that the idle screw now sensitizes an even more intense response. This is what I mean by going on autopilot. So they go from the state of hypervigilance with an idle screw turned up in terms of arousal level, and then perceiving a stimulus cue that's a threat or that then generates typically a fear response leading to an immediate action or response without thinking. Mr. Khan says, I will make a motion to strike at this point, calling for improper expert opinion. The court says, okay, the answer is stricken as anything regarding generating any sort of response. Starting with generating a fear response, that portion of the answer is stricken. Ms. Abramson says, I would like to be heard on that. The court says, and the rest of the answer will stand. Ms. Abramson says, I would like to be heard on that, Your Honor, specifically. Okay, go ahead with something else, says the court. Again, ignoring her, wanting to be heard. Ms. Abramson says, was in fact Dr. Vanderkolk, I can't say that so fast, Vanderkolk, was his entire research geared towards determining why it was that people, PTSD, had this overwhelming emergency response? Yes. And is that a well-documented feature of people with PTSD? They tend to overreact to this fear response. Objection irrelevant. Overruled, says the court. You can answer the question. The witness says the answer is yes. So they typically will react or overreact to fear-based responses. So when the door was closed in the den, they thought their parents were in there plotting against them. Whether that's true or not, we will never know, but it's very possible. And that cue, that closing of the door, to them signified they were in trouble. There was more trauma to be coming their way if they didn't do something to stop the threat. So Mr. Khan says objection irrelevant. The court says overruled. You can answer that one. He says yes. Ms. Abramson says, and has it been studied to the extent that it is understood that the overreaction is because they are overwhelmed with a sense of imminent death? Objection calls for speculation, no foundation in proper expert opinion. Sustained. Emerson says, isn't precisely the focus of the research why people with PTSD get overwhelmed with a sense of imminent harm? Objection irrelevant. Sustained. Well, Your Honor, I would like to be heard. The court says, let's take a break and we will let counsel be heard on all of these things that they would like to be heard on, and depending on how long it takes for them to be heard, well, we'll let you know when you can come back. The jury exits the jury exits the courtroom. And the court says, okay, so we're going to have a few arguments here. The court says, okay, the jury has left. Ms. Abramson says, well, We're always operating under dual principles here as we bounce between Section 28 and Section 29, Your Honor, of the Evidence Code. The whole point of the significance of relevance, if you recall, of a diagnosis of PTSD in a homicide case, the whole reason why the evidence is or should be relevant at all is because of this phenomenon of hyperarousal leading to an overwhelming response. This is what has been studied and what has been understood to be a behavioral consequence of PTSD. And as I was trying to elicit from this witness, there is ample research, and we can give the court just one example. In fact, we have one. The court says, first of all, the witness has testified to some extent, and he used the word imminent danger earlier in his testimony without objection. But Ms. Amerson says, right. The court says, but that's neither here nor there. You are now asking a specific. Ms. Amerson says, well, the court says, wait, I'm talking at this point. Okay, she says. The court says, you are now asking specific questions, and what does it matter if there is research on the subject? We are dealing with penal code sections and control what evidence is and is not admissible, and what's going on at Harvard Medical School or at Cleveland State University or wherever it is doesn't really matter. That's bogus. You absolutely do need to know what's going on in the field when it comes to scientific and medical advances and things of that nature. You can't just ignore that stuff. It has to come in, like it should. Ms. Abramson says, because it was my impression based on the court's ruling that I can't ask the specific question, was my client overwhelmed with imminent fear? That, obviously, I can't ask. The court says, well, it's clear from Eris and from Penal Code Section 29. Ms. Abramson says, exactly. What I should be able to ask, what's known as the typical reaction of people with PTSD, just as, go ahead, says the court. Just as Eris, battered women syndrome, was admissible to show the genesis of the belief of imminent harm, even if that belief wasn't reasonable. So you need to know that that people in those traumatic situations can act in a way that they're responding to them, it seems reasonable, but to an outsider, it seems unreasonable. So what I'm trying to show is that this is a common phenomenon of people with PTSD in situations with a sense of imminent harm. It is precisely the imminent harm that is the cause of overreaction. They go immediately from perception of danger to overwhelming terror and reaction. That is the core behavioral observation that has led to all of the research in what the chemical cause of that instantaneous overreaction is. So it's chemical in the sense that your body has changed to the point where you react in certain situations differently than people who aren't in a traumatized environment, an environment full of, traumatizing experiences. So that chemical cause, your biological changes in your body cause you to behave then in certain other ways. And that's the whole point, is that this PTSD, this battered woman syndrome, whatever you want to call it, whatever he has, he was so traumatized that in the moment he was acting out of his fight or flight um, persona. You have, when you're in that adrenaline rush, you're not necessarily thinking, or not thinking clearly, I should say. You're thinking, but it's not normal thoughts. All right, so she continues on saying, so I can't ask specifically, did Erik Menendez do that? I can only ask, as Eris indicated, was admissible of battered women syndrome. I can only ask, is this typical of people with PTSD? Is this a behavioral observation that's been documented? And that's all I'm trying to do. I am sort of between the cilia and I don't know how to say that, generalizations of specifics here. So I do believe that since this isn't just battered person syndrome, but this is PTSD, and there's a lot of literature on this particular phenomenon. Guys, imagine not knowing about PTSD. Like, we all know it's a given, and it is, it's definitely a real thing. And we understand it now, like most of us or have at least some general knowledge of PTSD, and that it can cause you to have triggered emotions and things like that. So, anyways, so she says it isn't. So I believe that since this isn't just battered persons, but this is PTSD, and there's a lot of literature on this particular phenomenon, that we should be entitled to ask these questions on the observed behavioral responses. It's still up to the jury to decide whether, in fact, my client had PTSD, whether, in fact, he was subjected to trauma that would have caused it, and whether, in fact, he was having that kind of instantaneous reaction. She's right. All of this should come into the jury so that they can decide, was Erik acting out of PTSD, battered person syndrome, or some kind of other traumatized state, or was he just a rich kid wanting the money, which never made sense to me, because once you kill the source of your money, then your income stops coming in. So that never made sense to me. But anyways, I think that doesn't usurp anything from the jury, but is nevertheless relevant because it is the linchpin of why we believe PTSD has a relationship to mental state at the time of the crime and to behavior at the time of the crime. And he has been chided for that behavior, Your Honor. I mean, in his cross examination, he's been asked, why didn't you just leave then? Why didn't you think to do this then? What was going through your mind? And when he gives answers that the only thing going through his mind was hurry and survive, he was ridiculed and sneered at. And yet, that is precisely the kind of limited range of cognition that people in this panicked state and this overreacting state with PTSD have been found to have. Bam. She makes such great arguments. She says them like she knows this case in and out. Like she ate, slept, and breathed it for all those years when she was still assigned as their lawyers. It was, I'm sure, one of the biggest things that ever consumed her entire life. Now, we didn't make up the research. It's out there. The court says again, the rules of evidence don't relate to what is out there in research, but what is admissible in a courtroom. All right, what is the people's response? Mr. Khan says, yeah, I think that counsel has already elicited from the witness precisely what the defendant's mental state was at the time of the commission of the crime and how that was bearing upon his actions at the time of the crime. She specifically asked him what were the effects of PTSD on Erik Menendez at the time of the commission of the crime, and it came out, and he has already testified to this. He spoke about the defendant being hypervigilant not only to repeated sexual abuse, but any other form of trauma or injury. He said that the defendant didn't see options or choices, that the defendant saw himself as vulnerable. He saw his father as fearful, or I believe he used the word a fearful person, and also that there was a heightened sense of sensitivity or accused behavior that was threatening him. So he was fully explained already before this jury the effects of PTSD upon the defendant at the time of the commission of the crime, and now counsel is seeking to go further, and she is flirting with danger here when she gets into the specific areas that are prohibited by Penal Code Section 29 and People versus Harris. There's no need at this point to start playing around with terms about imminent danger when that term is left in a vague response, in a vague way, with no reference as to what that specific term refers to or means. And if we go further into this area, it's inevitably going to lead to a violation of Penal Code 29 and People versus Harris, and there is simply no need at this point because of what has already been elicited from the witness. He has testified already to the effect of PTSD on the defendant at the time of the commission of the crime. That is out. That is accomplished. That is done, and there is simply no need at this point to go further and further in regards to undefined, undescribed, imminent danger situations, which is going to violate ARIS and Penal Code Section 29. Ms. Abramson says, well, I disagree with counsel. I think he is being very nonspecific, but I also disagree with what Eris says. Eris says that the evidence of the mental illness, if you will, or the mental disorder is admissible as it bears on the victim of such a disorder's perception of imminence. That's precisely what Eris says is one of the reasons why the evidence is admissible, not the reasonableness of that perception, which we don't go anywhere near. In fact, I think that I have purposely brought out that the reaction can be unreasonable, but not the reasonableness of the perception of imminence. But so basically, they can think that, they're reacting reasonably to something imminent, but it's not necessarily that's just their perception. But the actuality of the perception of imminence. The court says, well, if an expert testifies that someone actually perceived they were in imminent danger, I didn't ask him that, says Ms. Abramson. The court says, if an expert so testifies, or if the testimony is phrased in such a way where that is the nature of the response, then the questioner is violating Rule Penal Code Section 29, because that is, I understand that, says Ms. Abramson. The court says precisely what is prohibited from doing. Anything that removes from the province of the jury the decision as to the elements of the crime of murder is prohibited by Section 29 of the Penal Code. And what you're doing by asking questions in this fashion is structure it in a way that individuals who suffer from PTSD have the hyperarousal and the characteristics described by the witness, fear of imminent danger, and react to it. Now, if that's the testimony and that's tied to the diagnosis of the defendant, then there is no choice but to conclude from the witness's testimony that the defendant had that mental state of actual belief of imminent danger in the witness's diagnosis is believed. Ms. Amerson says, but that's a long way from if the witness's diagnosis is believed and if the underlying things upon which he bases that diagnosis is believed is still a long way from taking from the jury the issue of whether the defendant did in fact fear imminent harm. That's what they have to decide. The court says, Court says, well, Judge, how is it different? The court says he is saying this, that in my opinion, he is suffering from PTSD. In my opinion, someone suffering from PTSD has this heightened state of anxiety, and flowing from that is a belief, an actual belief of imminent danger of death or great bodily injury. And if he says that, well, Judge, says Ms. Abramson, the court says, then the natural inference is that the defendant had that mental state. Ms. Abramson says, well, there is nothing that says, inferentially, juries can't draw those conclusions. And let me just indicate to the court that if it were otherwise, you could get an expert to say, I diagnosed this defendant as having schizophrenia of an extreme form at the time of the crime. In that condition, a person cannot engage in the process that's known as deliberation. And in my opinion, the defendant did not deliberate, all of which has been found if the hypothetical facts with which I have been presented are true, then that person is not deliberating, which has been found to be admissible, and that's the whole basis of a diminished actuality defense. The court says no, that would not be admissible if an expert said that the person did not deliberate. That would not be admissible. Ms. Abramson says, then how is one ever to offer an opinion that schizophrenia impacts mental state at the time of the crime? You can do it by stepping back and saying, if thus and such is true, and they had schizophrenia at the time, and if they are impaired, as schizophrenics can be, from forming these deliberative cognitive functions, these are the deliberative cognitive functions that are required for deliberation. Basically saying, like, you can make it general and say, people who have PTSD, this is how I would expect them to behave. And if Erik had PTSD at the time of the crimes, I would expect this, that, and the other thing. So you can say it in generalities, but not specifics, if that makes sense, or at least that's her argument. She says, now that's no different than saying that what has been observed in people with PTSD is that they perceive a threat and their reaction is an overwhelming response. It's bypassing, and this is the neurological aspect of it as well. What has been discovered in the research is that neurologically and chemically, they're bypassing the cognitive portion of the brain in the sense of threat. It has been reported in their research is of an imminent harm. Now, that's not saying, therefore, Eric Menendez must have felt that way because it's easy to elicit, even on cross examination, that you cannot say specifically that a given person at a given time is sensing but that's simply one of the aspects of PTSD, and that has been documented in the research. So it doesn't. It isn't the opinion that was objected to and that we agreed would have been improper that Eric Menendez feared imminent harm at the time, which is the opinion that he can't give. Technically, I suppose we could do a diminished actuality, although I don't think that's the appropriate structuring of this evidence on the issue of malice, but I think that's a backwards and convoluted and clumsy way of doing this. I think what is known is that the overwhelming response is because this fear leads to a sense of imminence, and that the court interrupts and says, well, the trouble is, she says, we would. He says, wait, let me respond. The trouble is that the witness testifies in very broad fashion that someone who has been diagnosed as suffering from PTSD would have the reaction and would have this sense of imminent danger. That's not true. Now, he is not here at the moment, but some people would, some people wouldn't. But that's the point, and he's the expert, not you. So let's let him explain it then. Let's let him say, yes, some people would, some people wouldn't. And that's the defense, I'm sorry, that's the state's cross-examination to be like, well, you're just saying that or whatever. It's them to bring it out if that is or isn't true when they make a statement on direct examination. So then, the state can come and say, well, how many people don't react in that way, and then get your facts into the evidence instead of you just speculating, judge. He's just speculating. He says, now, if this testimony is in the absolute that someone with that diagnosis indeed, Ms. Abramson says, right, would suffer from such, then I think he is rendering an opinion of the ultimate fact that is for the jury to decide, not the witness. Ms. Abramson says, so perhaps if we do this, Your Honor, would the court find it appropriate then to ask a hypothetical based on my client's report of the mental process and ask if it's consistent or inconsistent with PTSD findings? That way, he's not saying it's absolute and everybody reacts that way, but he is also indicating what's true is that is a response that is consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. Court says, well, except that right now his testimony is, as I understand it, that everybody who suffers from PTSD goes through this whole process without exception. But you haven't he hasn't done cross yet. I'm sure the state's attorneys will ask that question. It seems to me that's the way it's been presented, as though if you've got someone with this diagnosis, boy, you're going to have somebody with this mental state, and it's just automatic. Oh my God. So that's your reason why you don't want it to come in, because you don't want it to give the jury this sense that it might be automatic, even though she could totally rectify that in her questioning. She says, I don't think that's what was asked. First of all, we talk about severity of symptoms. Someone in a situation faced with cues over a chronic period of abuse, and he wasn't permitted to answer whether that person would always sense imminent harm. So instead of pursuing it that way, why can't I ask, if you assume a diagnosis of PTSD, such as in his opinion he found my client to have suffered from at the time, is that, and given the fact of being faced with threats or of cues that indicate a threat of further trauma, is that consistent or inconsistent with the sufferer of PTSD from feeling a danger is imminent? Court says, all right. People wish to be heard on that? Yes, says Mr. Khan. Once again, I don't think that there should be reference to imminency. Counsel, once again, I think, has already asked the witness precisely what is admissible. That is, what are the effects of PTSD at the time of the commission of the crime? He has fully stated his opinion in that area, and I would object to any questions along the lines counsel is proposing, which is seeking to have this witness testify in an indirect way to precisely what he is prohibited from doing under both ARIS and Penal Code 29. Ms. Abramson says, I think Mr. Khan is misstating. He has not rendered his full opinion, and his full opinion would include, if he were allowed to give it, that based on all the facts and circumstances as known to him, that someone with PTSD to the degree that Erik suffered from it, when faced with these cues, would be overwhelmed with a sense of imminent harm. I mean, that's his actual opinion if he were permitted to give it, and counsel is objecting to that. So I think I should be permitted to ask a question having to do with, would an overwhelming sense of imminent harm be consistent with someone suffering from PTSD to the extent that he has found Erik Menendez to suffer from it, given the facts and circumstances of the confrontation with the parents on August 20th? Mr. Khan says, I would object to that. That is the equivalent of saying, did the defendant experience imminent harm or believe that there was imminent harm at the moment of the crime? Simply by saying it is consistent with doesn't mean that you're not taking testimony concerning what is prohibited. Okay, but isn't it possible that maybe in this particular case it needs to be discussed because of the dire situation that they were in? I know he keeps wanting to go back that this is somehow against penal code section whatever to talk about imminent harm, but it's already part of the testimony that they were in fear of their lives, right? So then why is this not allowed to come in? I guess it's the words themselves, the imminent harm. Maybe she needs to rephrase it. I don't know. Mr. Khan continues, the way the people would rebut that is by calling a witness to say, no, that is inconsistent. And once we take testimony concerning that is inconsistent, there we have it. It is now out in the open. We have now taken testimony concerning whether or not the defendant did or did not believe that there was imminent harm at the time of the commission of the crime. So, what Penal Code Section 29 seeks to do, it says testimony concerning that subject shall not be taken from this witness. So, the witness cannot give an opinion as to that issue and cannot say that it is consistent. The court says, let's stop and let the jury go for lunch. Mr. Khan says, and the witness should not be able to say that it is consistent or inconsistent. The court says, okay, what other questions do you propose to ask this witness along these lines as soon as we get the jury out? Ms. Abramson says, actually, that was the only one that I wasn't able to get a response from, just having to do with whether this. The court says, well, I imagine there are some other things you wanted to cover in that area. She says, I am going to cover other things in general. I wanted to go back to some other things with the court. This was basically just a general, in order to cut to the chase, if you will, offering his opinions in general about the PTSD at the time and how it interacted with the events. The bailiff says jurors are walking. The court says, okay. The jury exits the courtroom and they come back for more arguments. So hold on one second. All right. So I just wanted to see how much longer we have. Not much. So their arguments are just going to continue for a couple more pages, and then they're going to also go to lunch. So Ms. Abramson says, I intended to go through the chart of the actual events of that week and offer a series of hypothetical questions about whether the feelings and behaviors and perceptions that were reported by my client are consistent or inconsistent with various aspects of PTSD and the battered person syndrome. The court says, okay. And the people wish to be heard on that? Mr. Khan says, I would object to what we refer to in our motion as a blow-by-blow account of the events of that week. I don't think that the expert would be permitted to go through the events of that week and retell the story essentially that was already told by the defendant just for endorsing that story and for argument. Are you kidding? Don't you think that those events leading up to that week might be important in his state of mind? And I don't think this argument is going to fly for the court. I think he's going to let it in. The other stuff, probably not, but this stuff, yeah. So the effect of that type of presentation is to serve as co-counsel and to make argument to the jury as to the story told by the defendant. The witness is familiar with the testimony of the defendant. He indicated that he has interviewed the defendant and he read the testimony both from the trial and the last trial. If counsel is going to ask a question as to whether the defendant's behavior that week prior to the time of the crime was consistent with the person who is responding or acting in response to PTSD, that may be permissible, perhaps under Evidence Code Section 52. However, I would object to the blow-by-blow account that counsel is proposing, where the witness will then state an opinion that is in effect that his behavior that past week proves that the defendant was suffering from PTSD. Court says, all right. When you have when you say you have a chart, I haven't seen that chart. Ms. Abramson says, it's right here, Your Honor. Let me just say, I don't know of any rule that says you can't repeat the defendant's version of the story. I think prosecutors might like such a rule, but I don't know that one exists, in the hopes that the jury will forget. Is that the idea? This is the chart, Your Honor, and I can put it up here. The court says, all right. Miss Abramson says, at one point I had a smaller version of this, but I can't find it. I gave it to my graphics people, and basically what it does is it just recites a few of the events of the last week. And obviously, this obviates the need for the witness to repeat each and everything. And it doesn't even have all the details. It doesn't have all the precise statements that people made to each other. But the importance of this is for the witness to assess certain of these events in terms of some of the things that he's already been talking about. And I'm drawing a blank for a moment, Your Honor, excuse me. Things like, rescue fantasy and what happens when a rescue fantasy is destroyed. The feelings that Erik Menendez reports after that as being consistent or inconsistent with the sense of hopelessness. He is not going to talk about every single thing on this chart, but he is going to put it in context to what leads someone to the sense of desperation, or could lead someone to the sense of desperation in the narrowing of vision and the focusing on threat, which is typical of what happens to people with PTSD when their hypervigilance is asking for cues and they perceive a cue of impending danger. How it narrows their vision and puts them in the state of hyperarousal, and how the events that occurred that week either add to or diminish that state hypothetically of hyperarousal. The court says, okay, well, some things are in red, some are not. Ms. Abramson says they have significance to the witness. This is what they have. That's why we're in red. The court says, and are you going to refer to the things in red or the other things as well? Ms. Abramson says, well, I mean, I am not the one who is testifying, Your Honor. It's my understanding that the witness isn't going to repeat every word on that chart, but that the chart is a guide to the events and he is going to focus on those that are significant from a PTSD standpoint. The court says, well, I am unclear as to what he's going to say. He is going to just be given free rein to talk about what's on the chart and what occurred that week and give his analysis, or is he going to be asked a specific question, assuming this occurred that week? Do you have an opinion as to whether or not that is consistent? Right. With the diagnosis. Right. What? What is right? What you said, Your Honor, assuming this happened and this was the reaction, is that consistent or inconsistent with a person who is suffering from PTSD from this source? That's exactly right. And I may ask him to explain why in certain situations, but in others, I think it'll be obvious. Court says, well, all right. Well, I will have to hear the specifics of those questions to rule on them. I would say if one was to use the entirety of the material on that chart, it would tend to be unduly repetitious of testimony of others. Why? Why can't you talk about the events of that day or that week? It's evidence. Why can't you talk about it? That makes no sense. But if you isolate on specific things that are significant, perhaps it wouldn't be repetitious. Ms. Abramson says, well, Your Honor, frankly, I am at a loss to understand a rule that says when an expert witness is talking about what is significant in the reaction of events of a homicide, that there is a repetitiousness rule. It isn't my client repeating it, and there was no rule that the cross-examination, which lasted 12 days, was repetitious. My point is that what's significant to this witness is significant to this witness, and I don't think that some notion that he can't repeat or restate information that came from the defendant because it came from the defendant. Cuts her off and says, well, number one, he wouldn't be doing that. He would be asked to assume certain facts because he has no knowledge of what the events were. Exactly, says Miss Abramson. Court says, exactly. So he won't be saying the facts at all. He will be asked to assume certain facts and based upon those assumptions, give certain opinions. Right, says Miss Abramson. So that's why I don't understand why a repetitiousness objection is appropriate. The court says, it depends upon what I said. I will have to wait to hear the questions. So you're not going to rule on shit, is pretty much what he said. Okay, says Miss Abramson. The court says, I said if everything on that chart was asked, it would perhaps be repetitious. Until I hear what's being asked, I can't answer it. In terms of the other objection, I will review Eris again, and we will have a further resolution of that in 103 to the extent, or I'm sorry, at 130. We will have a resolution to that at 130 to the extent of the witness's testimony. Ms. Abramson says, okay. Court says, all right, we will be in recess until 1:30. So that's where we're going to leave for now. I'm sure they're going to come back and have a little conversation, and the judge will give his response, and then the direct examination of Dr. Wilson will continue in part 79. So thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Take care. That's the end of this Trial Transcripts Exposed. Thanks for following along with me. Like if you want more, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below. See you next time.